Sarah Yarborough was born on June 12, 1975, in Portland. Her parents soon moved to another state, settling in Federal Way, a suburb outside of Seattle. Sarah had 2 siblings and was particularly close to her youngest brother. From a young age, she had a passion for music and ballet. She worked hard in school with the goal of attending a good university. Her academic achievements led her to participate in a school program that took her to New Zealand twice. Later on, Sarah joined her high school's cheerleading team and had a wide circle of friends. She was known for her kindness and willingness to help others in need. On the morning of Saturday, December 14, 1991, when she was 16 years old, Sarah had a gathering with her cheerleading team for an event. They were supposed to meet at the school building where the bus would pick them up. She drove her father's car to the school but arrived at the wrong time. She thought the bus would pick them up at 8 a.m., but it was scheduled for 9 a.m. Her friends gradually arrived at the meeting point, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Some students noticed her car in the parking lot, but she wasn't inside. She didn't appear even when the bus arrived for the students. Her friends found this strange, but back then, none of them had mobile phones, so they couldn't contact her. Around the same time, 2 12-year-old children were walking on the school grounds, exploring the wooded area behind the tennis courts. They noticed something unusual. A man emerged from behind the bushes, took a breath, and walked away in the opposite direction. The children found it odd, but didn't pay much attention and continued walking. A few meters ahead, they encountered a horrifying sight. A young woman lying on the ground, unresponsive. They thought she might be dead. The children ran home to tell their parents, and one of the children's parents went back to the scene with them. The other child's father decided to follow the suspicious man they had seen earlier. The child mentioned seeing a car that resembled a Chevrolet Nova leaving the area. Since he lived near the school, his father decided to try to locate that car. At one point, he spotted a similar car but quickly lost sight of it, unable to find it again. Meanwhile, the parents of the other child went to the school and realized that the young woman on the ground was likely deceased. They immediately rushed to the school building and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that the young woman was indeed deceased. They were also able to quickly determine that the deceased was Sarah. The police concluded, based on the marks on her neck, that the victim had been strangled. Some of her belongings were found near her body, including her jacket, underwear, and socks. Strangely, her purse and car keys were discovered in the school parking lot, leading investigators to suspect that the assailant might have attacked her near her car and then dragged her behind the trees. The body was handed over to forensic experts, and the police began their search for clues. Their initial step was to interview all the people who were in the school premises and its vicinity. 2 boys who had found Sarah provided a rough description of the man who had emerged from behind the bushes near her body. They described him as a tall man around 20 years old, with shoulder-length reddish hair, dressed in a dark coat and black pants. Soon, the police managed to locate another witness, and here is where a surprising twist in the story unfolds. The man who had gone for a run observed a strange scene in the same wooded area. A girl was lying next to the bushes, and a man was hovering over her. The girl showed no movement at all, and the witness initially thought that a couple had decided to be intimate in that spot. A few minutes later, he ran on the same road in the opposite direction, and both the man and the girl were still there. In both instances, it did not appear to him that a serious crime was being committed. The witness explained to the police that he had recently immigrated to the United States from another culture and was unsure of the typical behavior in the country. Nevertheless, this witness provided the police with a rough description of the assailant, which matched the descriptions given by the children who discovered the body. Investigators interviewed dozens of people who had been near the school but did not find any other useful leads. Meanwhile, medical experts examined Sarah's body and concluded that the cause of her death was strangulation. Apparently, the assailant had used his own socks, and a severe head wound was also found on the girl. Experts believed that the victim had lost consciousness due to this blow, which aligned with the runner's account of seeing the girl lying motionless on the ground. Forensic experts examined Sarah's clothing and found traces of male particles on nearly all of her garments. However, in 1991, there was no DNA database to compare these samples to, so investigators could only rely on direct comparisons of DNA samples from specific suspects. There was another lead that detectives pointed out, although forensic experts found traces of male particles on Sarah's clothing. The forensic doctors stated that there were no signs of sexual assault on her body. With all this information in hand, investigators formed their own opinion of what had happened. Sarah had arrived at the school nearly an hour early, and there was no one else in the parking lot but her. It was most likely that her assailant saw her there, waited for her to exit the car, struck her in the head with an object, causing her to lose consciousness. He then dragged her out of the parking lot behind some trees, where her body would later be found. The assailant had removed some of her clothing and engaged in lewd acts before strangling her with her own socks. When one of the children who discovered Sarah's body reported the car in which the assailant had supposedly fled, detectives initiated a search for a Chevrolet Nova. They quickly found one, but it turned out that the driver of that car had just delivered donuts that morning and provided his DNA sample, which did not match the DNA found on Sarah's clothing. It appeared that the children had simply seen the vehicle driving on the road next to them and mistakenly thought the perpetrator was behind the wheel. In fact, none of the children could remember with exact certainty if they had seen a man approach a car from the bushes. Over the following days, the police officers continued to search for witnesses and new leads, but there were no significant breakthroughs. Classes resumed on Monday, despite the horror that had occurred. Apart from the fact that the murder had taken place just a few meters from their school, the perpetrator remained at large, and his identity was unknown. The girls were afraid to walk alone on the premises, so the boys from the sports teams took it upon themselves to accompany each female student to their car or bus to ensure they weren't left alone on the street. Investigators learned that there were approximately 70 potential witnesses of the school and its surroundings that morning, and they interviewed each one of them, but no new details emerged. Based on the accounts of the two children and the runner, a sketch of the assailant was created and distributed to all local newspapers and television stations. The story received extensive media coverage, and in the weeks that followed, the police received hundreds of tips. Investigators diligently checked each and every one of them, but in every case, they hit a dead end. At one point, they received a lead on a man who matched the murder suspect's description and had a criminal record. However, the detectives were unsuccessful in this lead as well, as his DNA did not match the sample found on the victim's clothing. Since then, the case remained stagnant for months. The police received a total of 4,000 different tips and attempted to work with each one of them, but the resources of the local police department were simply insufficient to handle the volume of information. Time was also working against them, as new cases required the investigators' attention every month. When Sarah's family discovered that the police lacked the resources to manage all the tips, they tried to help as much as they could. One family member worked for a technology company and convinced the company's management to temporarily provide the police department with a powerful computer valued at $150,000. In the 1990s, this was a substantial sum, but the company agreed. With this computer, the police could store information on all the leads in one place, process them more quickly, and categorize them for easy review. Despite their efforts, each lead led to a dead end, and they made no progress in the following years. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, And before their graduation, they decided to commemorate their friend by raising a significant amount of money and using it to create a memorial. It was a bench where Sarah's belongings were cast in metal. Alongside these items was a photo of the girl's dog reaching for her purse. Over the years, the case was periodically reopened, re-examining all available evidence, but the outcome remained the same. They still couldn't get closer to capturing the perpetrator. During this time, the police interviewed several thousand people and collected DNA samples from almost 300 possible suspects, but all efforts were in vain. In 2011, 20 years after the murder, one of the detectives decided to turn to modern technology. He had heard about a company working in the field of genetic genealogy. The detective contacted them and asked, "Can you try to locate the relatives of the person who left their DNA on the victim's body?" The experts took on the task, but unfortunately, they failed. Firstly, in 2011, genetic genealogy was just beginning to gain momentum, and the experts were limited in their capabilities. For example, they couldn't yet search for both male and female relatives within the same sample. If they had DNA from a man, they could only search for familial connections with other men, and vice versa. Secondly, they faced legal obstacles in the form of various laws that prohibited the use of genetic data samples to search for relatives of suspects. However, their efforts did yield some interesting results. On one hand, the team of researchers that the detective approached have been working for several years on creating a genetic pedigree of the first people who arrived in the United States from Britain in 1620 on the Mayflower. After studying the DNA of Sarah's assailant, they discovered that the man was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, tracking him through this lineage was nearly impossible, especially in those years. The Mayflower carried just over 100 people, but over the centuries, the number of their descendants has surpassed 25 million. Secondly, the detective had no idea that he had turned Sarah's case into the first of its kind, even though his initial attempt was unsuccessful. It was the first crime that was attempted to be solved with the help of genetic genealogy. The detective tried to utilize the available information and located several men with the last name Fuller who lived in the area of his city at the time of Sarah's murder. He found photos of them and met with the only witnesses, a runner and two men who had found the body when they were children. Unfortunately, none of them recognized the murderer from the photos. Finally, the investigator requested DNA samples from all the Fullers in the area, and they were sent to the laboratory. None of them matched the DNA of the assailant, but something interesting happened here. The experts discovered that one of these men was indeed a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from the same Mayflower ship. However, he was definitely not the murderer, nor did he know of any distant relative living nearby. It's possible that the perpetrator of the crime was related to him through such a distant relative that their family simply never knew of the connection. The detective retired in 2017, and the case was handed over to a new team of investigators. They reached out to the company that had taken over the study of the DNA sample from the assailant in 2011. By then, the capability to study genetic material had advanced significantly, and the experts agreed to try to trace the assailant's lineage. It took them 2 years of painstaking work, using public databases to find even the most distant relatives of the assailant, then manually tracing their family connections to individuals who lived during the time of Sarah's death. In total, they had to eliminate several thousand individuals before they finally got a break. In September 2019, they came up with 2 new possible suspects, brothers Edward and Patrick Nicholas, who, as the DNA showed, were descendants of Robert Fuller. The experts determined that it was highly likely that a DNA sample from Sarah's clothing belonged to one of 2 brothers. At the time of the murder, one was 33 years old and the other was 27. The older brother turned out to be a career criminal with an extensive history of violent offenses. He had been in prison and his DNA sample was in the FBI database, which meant he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder because his DNA would have shown a match in the 1990s if he were the perpetrator. As for the younger brother, named Patrick Nicholas, he had also been arrested multiple times by the police for violent crimes, including against minors. However, this was before the DNA samples of such offenders were added to the database. The detectives immediately placed the man under surveillance. Patrick, who was 55 years old at the time, lived in a neighboring city called Wellington. The police had been following his every move for 2 days, and soon, an opportunity presented itself. Patrick went to the laundromat, and while waiting for his clothes to wash, he stepped outside to smoke and discarded a cigarette butt on the ground. One of the officers immediately collected it in an evidence bag and returned to his car. Patrick stepped out to smoke for a second time, and this time, a cloth handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The officers pick it up. The police settled for taking the second piece of evidence in case the experts couldn't extract a DNA sample from the cigarette butt. However, the forensic experts were able to easily obtain samples from all these items, and the following day, they delivered the long-awaited news to the detective. Patrick's DNA was a perfect match with the traces found on Sarah's clothing in 1991. The judge immediately issued an arrest warrant for the man, and the police took him into custody. It took 5 days for the investigators to ascertain his name before formally charging him with murder. When his biography was leaked to the media, many began to ask a perfectly logical question. Why was a man with such a history of criminal activity not even considered a suspect for all these 28 years? At the age of 19, Patrick Nicholas approached a young woman and got into her car, where he attempted to assault her. The victim managed to escape and flee, but she had to jump into a river and swim for a long time to reach a safe distance from her assailant. Patrick spent 4 years in prison before being released. The next offense for which he was arrested occurred in 1994 when he tried to assault a minor. He was detained again, but his DNA was not recorded in any database. The reason is peculiar. The charge for which he was prosecuted was not serious enough to collect DNA, and the police never came across his name in 3 decades. He also did not appear in any of the 4,000 leads obtained over the years. It was also revealed why genetic genealogy experts couldn't trace him back to Robert Fuller. It turned out that Patrick's biological lineage was adopted, and he grew up with the adoptive surname. One of the men who discovered Sarah's body when they were children in 1991 immediately asserted that Patrick was undoubtedly the same killer. He admitted that the incident had deeply affected him. He was only 12 years old when the body was discovered, and the perpetrator had seen his face. For many years, the witness lived in constant fear that the killer would come after him, and only after Patrick's arrest did he finally feel safe. Patrick's trial did not begin until 2023. The man insisted he was innocent, and his lawyer attempted to challenge the main piece of evidence, the DNA. He argued that the presence of Patrick's DNA on the victim's clothing did not prove his guilt, but that argument did not hold. The lawyer also tried to challenge the accuracy of the DNA analysis, but the experts declared such claims to be entirely untenable. Ultimately, Patrick was found guilty of first-degree murder without premeditation. On May 25th, he was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison, making it virtually impossible for him to ever be released. During the sentencing, Patrick showed no emotion, unlike Sarah's family. They also spoke before the judge, thanking everyone involved in the trial and the investigators for bringing the killer to justice, despite his ability to elude it for 28 years. Alice Gross was born on Valentine's Day, February 14th, in the year 2000 in London. She was raised in a loving family and had an older sister. Alice demonstrated a passion for creativity from a very young age, enjoying drawing, playing the piano, and the violin. She also had an interest in fashion design, and at the age of 11, she even made a dress for her school graduation. At 14 years old, Alice was diagnosed with anorexia and depression. Despite these challenges, she continued to engage in creative activities and showed great potential for future success. On August 28, 2014, during the school holidays, Alice told her mother she was going for a walk. She enjoyed strolling along the small water canal and river near her home in Hanwell, a suburb of London. Her usual walk was about 4.5 kilometers long. She left around 3 p.m., promising to return by 6 p.m. Later, she texted her father, saying she would be home soon. Alice did not return at the expected time, and by 7 p.m., with her phone turned off, her parents became anxious. Given her battle with anorexia and depression, they feared something had happened to her, particularly because her physical condition could lead to weakness or fainting. Her parents contacted her friends in hopes that she might be with them, but no one had seen her that day. They then decided to call the police. The search began immediately, focusing on Alice's usual route. Friends and relatives joined the police in their efforts. Although no trace of Alice was initially found, detectives managed to gather several eyewitness accounts that helped them establish a more accurate route for the search and identify specific surveillance cameras that might have captured her. Reviewing the footage, detectives saw Alice shortly after she left home, heading towards the Grand Union Canal, and later near the Brentford area along the canal. The last camera captured her returning close to her home, near Trumpers Way Bridge. The media were alerted about the missing teenager, and her case was quickly broadcast throughout London. Thanks to this coverage, detectives received multiple calls from people who reported seeing Alice. Unfortunately, none of these efforts brought the police any closer to finding the girl. According to the security camera footage and witness statements, Alice had disappeared on her way home, having completed most of her usual route. But what happened to her remained a mystery. 3 days passed. The police continued to scrutinize the camera footage from nearby areas and also inspected local parks and other secluded areas. Meanwhile, patrol officers canvassed the homes along Alice's route and questioned local residents. On September 1st, Alice's family recorded a video message pleading for her to return home. They also asked anyone with information about her whereabouts to contact the police. Investigators were considering several theories at the time. The most disturbing was the possibility of abduction. Even though Alice's route was mostly through city streets, there were many remote and hidden areas where she could have been attacked. Kidnappings were not unheard of in London, even less so in the suburbs. Another theory was that Alice had run away from home. Her parents feared that her depression might have led her to make such a decision. They also did not rule out the possibility that she might have taken her own life due to her illness. However, the police found these theories to be unlikely. At 14, it seemed improbable that Alice could have run away and hidden herself without help. And if she had taken her own life, her body would likely have been found. The case was drawing increasing public attention and was handed over to the Special Unit of Scotland Yard on September 3rd. Although they typically worked on murder cases, the detectives considered the possibility of the girl returning home to be high. Scotland Yard organized a massive search which was immediately joined by hundreds of volunteers. After seeing the heart-wrenching appeal from her parents and sister on the news, concerned Londoners combed the area from dawn till dusk. The next day, detectives announced the discovery of the first solid piece of evidence. They had found Alice's backpack, which contained the shoes she had been wearing that day. It was found relatively close to her home. This discovery allowed the police to narrow their search, focusing on a small area near the canal. Investigators realized it was unlikely that Alice would have removed her own shoes, thrown them with her backpack, and run away. She did not have a spare pair of shoes with her, which complicated the situation even more. Scotland Yard decided to release all available security camera footage of Alice. The backpack and shoes indicated that the girl might be in serious danger. The main theory continued to be that of abduction, but investigators had not completely ruled out the possibility of suicide. Therefore, they attempted to use all available resources to locate her. The release of the footage could attract more public attention, and someone might remember seeing Alice that day. Along with this, several hundred more people from various agencies joined the search, and there were now 600 people working on the case. The investigation thus became the largest in terms of police involvement since the year 2005. Some of them were inspecting the area directly, while others reviewed footage from the hundreds of cameras that Alice might have been captured on. Scotland Yard offered a reward of £20,000 for any information that could help find Alice Gross, although they were unable to locate her phone. They did, however, provide the mobile phone company with details of her last known location. It turns out Alice had sent a message to her father from nearly the same place where her backpack would later be found. This suggested that investigators should focus their efforts in that specific area. Therefore, a thorough search of a several square kilometer area was decided upon, with every meter of land and water being manually examined. Police teams meticulously scoured the river and canal for any evidence. 2 days after her backpack was discovered, it was reported that police had detained a 25-year-old man on suspicion of Alice's murder. The following day, another man was arrested, but details were not disclosed until the investigation was clearer. However, both suspects were released soon after, as Scotland Yard could not establish their involvement in Alice's disappearance. More than a week passed with no progress in the case. It wasn't until September 16th that police issued another statement. They were seeking a 40-year-old man named Arnis Zalkalns in connection with Alice's disappearance. He had moved to England from Latvia 7 years prior and lived in the area as a construction worker. Scotland Yard's interest in him was piqued for 2 reasons that at first glance seemed unrelated. Firstly, Zalkalns' co-workers reported him missing to the police on September 3rd. He had not shown up for work, was not answering his phone, and was not at home. It appeared he had simply vanished. Secondly, detectives discovered that Zalkalns' route from his home to work roughly followed the same path Alice had taken on the day she disappeared. The detectives soon uncovered something truly disturbing. Security camera footage showed a middle-aged man on a bicycle crossing the bridge Alice had crossed just minutes before. This man was identified as Zalkalns. The travel time between these cameras should have taken only minutes, yet it took the man nearly an hour to pass this stretch, raising questions about what he was doing during that time. It was determined that he could not have taken a longer route to the next camera. It simply wasn't there. Moreover, it was concluded that the man's clothes were wet when he re-emerged onto the road. The cameras later recorded him returning to the same area 2 hours later and leaving again 50 minutes after that without being caught by the camera at the bridge, indicating he had spent all this time within a small blind spot and had changed clothes. About an hour later, Zalkalns was recorded in a local shop buying beer. The next morning, he returned to the same blind spot between the cameras around 7 a.m. and again in the afternoon. This was enough evidence to obtain the search warrant for his house, where he lived with his girlfriend and 2 daughters. His roommate had no idea where Zalkalns had gone. Upon learning he was a suspect in the girl's murder, the roommate said Zalkalns could never have done such a thing, describing him as a caring and attentive father. However, Scotland Yard investigated Zalkalns' background and uncovered a truly sinister past. In 1998, while in Latvia, Zalkalns had coldly and calculatedly murdered his wife, burying her in a pre-dug grave in the forest, for which he only served 7 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he moved to England, and the local authorities were not even aware of his criminal past in his home country. Police searching Zalkalns' house found a freshly dug plot on his property. They did not reveal if they found any evidence there, but they did make a significant discovery in the basement: a broken back panel of a white iPhone 4S, the same model Alice had possessed. A search of his computer revealed that he had searched for information about Alice Gross's disappearance days after the incident. Consequently, Zalkalns was added to the wanted list. Fearing he may have fled to Latvia or another European country, Scotland Yard issued a search across the European Union. However, they could not find a single trace of the suspect. A month had passed since Alice's disappearance, and on September 30th, the police made a grim announcement. A human body was found in a river near the area of the girl's disappearance. The body was not immediately identified, but the police shared a chilling detail. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep the body submerged and hidden from the surface. The next day, the police confirmed that the deceased was Alice Gross. There was no longer any doubt. The exact location where the body was found was where she had disappeared, and the cause of death was strangulation. Alice's body had been wrapped in construction bags, tied to a large tree stump. Furthermore, a structure had been built using a bicycle wheel and bricks to keep the body submerged. She was found wearing only a sock. Detectives visited the workplace of Arnis Zalkalns and discovered that the same type of bags used to conceal Alice Gross's body had also been used at the construction site where he worked. Following the discovery of the body, the police continued their search for Zalkalns, working closely with Interpol and local European intelligence agencies. However, no trace of him was found. This continued until October 4, when investigators made an unexpected discovery. They found a man's body hanging in a park, just a kilometer from where Alice had been murdered. 2 days later, it was confirmed that the deceased was Arnis Zalkalns. This development was unforeseen. The prevailing theory of Scotland Yard was that the suspect had fled to Europe, but it turned out he had been in the vicinity the entire time. Medical experts concluded that the man had taken his own life on the day of his disappearance, September 3, and he was not found for a month. There was nothing surprising in the discovery location. Zalkalns had chosen a very remote and inaccessible spot, making it exceedingly difficult to locate him. With Zalkalns' DNA in hand, investigators had even more evidence. Close to where Alice's body was found, the police discovered a cigarette butt, which was sent to the laboratory. The DNA extracted from the filter matched Zalkalns' sample. Moreover, the laboratory stated that it was very likely that the perpetrator's DNA would be found on the victim's body, although they could not state this with absolute certainty due to the time the body had been underwater. His DNA was also found on the girl's backpack and shoes. By that time, the police had uncovered another horrifying fact. It turned out that 2 years after moving to England, Zalkalns had abused a 14-year-old girl about a kilometer from where Alice's body was found. The man attempted some kind of indecent act, but the victim survived, and the man was arrested. This is where things get complicated. The girl did not press formal charges, and the assailant was simply released. It's not entirely clear how this could have happened, but the fact remains that an adult man who had abused a girl fell into the hands of the police and was freed from punishment. Moreover, information about the case came to light after the discovery of the perpetrator's body in the park. Nevertheless, the police continued their investigation and took some time to reconstruct what had happened. According to their findings, on that unfortunate day of August 28, Zalkalns was cycling along the same route that Alice was walking. He found her in a secluded area hidden from public view and attacked her with the intention of committing depraved acts. We will never know exactly how events unfolded from there, but the outcome was tragic. He killed Alice and then hid her body in various locations, always returning to the scene of the crime. We will also never understand why he decided to take his own life after what he had done. It is very debatable whether this can be called a manifestation of conscience. Alice's parents, who have endured such a terrible tragedy, felt outraged by the government's handling of the situation. They questioned how the British authorities had allowed a convicted murderer to enter the country and stay here. For years, they have been fighting for the government to tighten immigration controls to keep criminals at bay. Unfortunately, to this day, they have not managed to make a significant difference. A month after Alice's body was discovered, another noteworthy incident occurred. The coroner responsible for the investigation had left a folder with case documents on a train. 30 pages contained important information about the murder, including medical information and undisclosed details. The public, the media, and Alice's parents harshly criticized the police. However, they could do nothing about it as the file could not be found. Nevertheless, the deceased suspect was not judged by anyone. Investigators said that if he had been alive, they would have had enough evidence to take the case to court. But there was no guarantee of a conviction. The problem was that all the evidence available against Zalkalns was circumstantial, and there was little chance of securing a conviction. However, an inquest was held in court where the jury acknowledged an already evident fact. Alice had been murdered. Her death was not an accident. The procedure was formal and did not play a significant role. Alice's funeral took place on October 23. 1,000 people attended her memorial. And at the end of the ceremony, a beautiful song that the girl had written and sung herself was projected on a large screen. Guayaquil, the capital of the Guayas province, is one of the largest cities in Ecuador. Located on a peninsula by the Guayas River, it serves as the country's commercial hub. Known as the gateway to the Pacific beaches and the famous Galapagos Islands, Guayaquil is also a major port and center for imports and exports. It's the second most populated city in Ecuador, after Quito, with a rough estimate of 2.7 million inhabitants. Approximately 400,000 of these residents live in Guasmo Sur, one of the informal neighborhoods in the southern central part of the city. Guasmo Sur is considered the poorest neighborhood in Guayaquil. It struggles with overpopulation, poverty, and frequent criminal activities. Most of its current inhabitants are migrants from rural areas who moved to this urban but isolated part of Guayaquil seeking better employment opportunities and an improved quality of life. The majority of the buildings in Guasmo Sur are made of blocks, yet some houses are constructed with wood, cardboard, and other common materials. The area was named Guasmo because of the once abundant tropical trees of the same name, which were later felled to pave the way for urban development and local industries. In 2018, 19-year-old Kathleen Alexandra Leana resided in Guasmo Sur. Her residence was owned by Ramiro Alta Morano. According to him, it wasn't profitable to rent out one of his ground floor spaces for businesses, as tenants frequently failed and returned the keys. As a result, he decided to remodel the commercial space into a residential apartment. The first tenants arrived on August 9, 2018. A family consisting of a mother and her 4 children, with Kathleen Leana being the oldest daughter. He lived on the upper floor of the same building. Relatives and neighbors of Kathleen Leana described her as a calm girl with no signs of violent tendencies. By October 2018, Kathleen was working because she had applied for a university spot, which she unfortunately did not secure. Less than 5 kilometers away from Guasmo Sur lies Isla Trinitaria, an area crisscrossed by the Perimeter Road and also plagued with security issues. Isla Trinitaria has a predominantly Afro-descendant population, with many of their homes being built on illegally acquired land and constructed with cement and cane. In Isla Trinitaria, 21-year-old Veronica Jasmine Silva Ruiz lived in the southern part of the main port. Veronica Silva was studying systems engineering at the University of Guayaquil and was about to begin her second semester. She lived with her parents and siblings, being the youngest daughter of Alberto Silva and Maria Ruiz. Many claimed that Veronica and Kathleen Leana had been friends since school days, but Veronica's mother was unaware of this relationship and did not know Kathleen. However, it's confirmed that both young women shared two things in common. They were neighbors and both knew Yarborough, a 20-year-old man. Maria Ruiz, Veronica's mother, also didn't know about the alleged romantic relationship her daughter had with Jer, who had also been Kathleen Leana's romantic partner. On the morning of Tuesday, October 2, 2018, Veronica left her home early. By 9 a.m., she bid her parents farewell, heading to the University of Guayaquil. That was the last time they saw her alive. Her mother mentioned that Veronica went to the university without breakfast as she needed to submit a document and intended to return home quickly for lunch. Her father mentioned expecting her home around 11 a.m. When they didn't hear from her, her disappearance was reported to the prosecutor's office on the morning of Wednesday, October 3, 2018. 34 hours after Veronica's departure, her elder sister Rudy received a mysterious friend request on Facebook. A 20-year-old man identified himself as Veronica's boyfriend, claiming he knew of Veronica's whereabouts since his ex-mother-in-law had shown him some of her personal belongings. These items were found in an apartment in Guasmosur, which belonged to Kathleen Leana. Rudy informed her parents about this Facebook conversation, and they went to the flagrancy unit of the state prosecutor's office that Wednesday night to report the information. Around 7 p.m., investigators from the National Department of Crimes Against Life, Violent Deaths, Disappearances, Extortion, and Kidnapping confirmed that the body they had discovered dismembered at 2 p.m. that same day matched the family's descriptions. Initially, it was believed that Veronica never went to the university that day, but had been lured to Kathleen Leana's apartment, located 6 blocks from where they found Veronica's dismembered body.
Leana allegedly called Veronica to gossip about her boyfriend, who had previously been Leana's partner and, according to Leana, was still secretly seeing her. Later, it was confirmed that Veronica did attend the university on the morning of October 2, 2018, as she had told her parents. This account was
Corroborated by a university professor and later shared with agents from the National Department of Crimes Against Life, Violent Deaths, Disappearances, Extortion, and Kidnapping when they were investigating the disappearance. Veronica Silva was last seen at the university with a young woman believed to be Kathleen Leana and a young man. Their identities could not be confirmed as the faculty's security cameras were offline. By the afternoon of Wednesday, October 13, 2018, Veronica Silva's body was discovered inside 2 black bags placed within plastic boxes on a tricycle in Guasmosur. Bystanders, upon discovering the human remains, alerted the authorities. The tricycle was seized for investigation. At 10:30 p.m. on Wednesday, October 3, Kathleen Leana confessed to the murder. "I cut her in half," she informed the police. Her account of the crime was harrowing. Kathleen claimed she had invited Veronica Silva to her home on Tuesday, October 2, under the pretext of gossip. In reality, she wanted to confront her about the relationship Veronica allegedly had with Kathleen's ex-boyfriend. The two were supposedly still seeing each other secretly, and he had proposed to Veronica. When Veronica tried to leave, Kathleen threatened her with a knife. Kathleen tied Veronica's arms behind her back with plastic and began strangling her with an electrical cord. According to Kathleen, Veronica pleaded to be let go. There were moments Kathleen would relent, only to tighten the cord again. At some point, Veronica attempted to grab a knife, resulting in a struggle on the floor where Kathleen eventually strangled Veronica to death. After the murder, Kathleen tried to dismember the body with a kitchen knife but couldn't sever the head. She attempted to burn the face with alcohol, succeeding only in burning Veronica's hair and face. With family due home soon, Kathleen hid the body beneath her bed, covering it with stuffed animals and sheets. Disturbingly, she slept that night with Veronica's body still under the bed. On Wednesday, October 3, 2018, Kathleen decided to incinerate the body but failed. She placed the body parts in bags and sought out her uncle, Jose Rodriguez, to borrow his work tricycle. Initially hesitant, he eventually lent it to her. When she delayed returning it, he went to look for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Kathleen later told him the tricycle had been stolen, but he discovered from colleagues that the police had confiscated it due to its involvement in a death. Kathleen also admitted to asking a passerby for help loading the heavy bags onto the tricycle. After placing Veronica's remains on the tricycle, Kathleen paid a minor cousin $5 to help her push the tricycle towards a garbage dump, with the boy unaware of the gruesome contents within the bags. 5 blocks away from Kathleen's house, one of the bags fell off the tricycle. Panicking, Kathleen fled when a security guard approached her for littering. Ramiro, the owner of the building where the murder occurred, reported never hearing any alarming noises or cries from upstairs. He only noticed a strong scent, similar to chicken blood. Considering that chickens are frequently slaughtered in the area, he dismissed the smell, not thinking it came from a human body or his own building. In fact, he even considered confronting them about a potential spill, but his wife advised against it. That night, over 10 police officers raided his house. Upon surrendering to the police, Kathleen Leana claimed she acted alone. However, investigators were suspicious there might be other accomplices. Veronica's mother, Maria Ruiz, also doubted Kathleen's solitary involvement, pointing out her daughter's height and strength. Given Kathleen's story, the primary theory presented by the National Department of Crimes Against Life, violent deaths, disappearances, extortion, and kidnapping, was that of a crime of passion stemming from jealousy. Specifically, it was believed to revolve around a presumed love triangle involving Veronica Silva, Kathleen Leana, and Jair Alexander. It's noteworthy that Veronica's mother had never heard of these individuals before. Later, Kathleen changed her account, implicating Jair in the crime. She alleged that Jair was prostituting them via a website and participated in Veronica's murder by holding the electrical cord used for strangulation. According to the attorney representing Veronica's family, the young university student was murdered for refusing to engage in prostitution via a website supposedly run by Jair. In September 2019, Kathleen Leana was sentenced to 34 years and 8 months in prison for the murder and dismemberment of Veronica Silva in October 2018. Kathleen's defense appealed the ruling, considering it unjust. In October 2020, an appeal hearing was held, conducted virtually due to the coronavirus pandemic. The presiding judge denied the defense's claims, who now argued Kathleen had only discarded the body, not committed the murder. The verdict against Kathleen Leana included a fine of 1,000 basic salaries to the state and a $20,000 compensation to the victim's mother. During a hearing at the prosecutor's General State Flagrancy Unit, Kathleen Leana's defense requested a psychological evaluation for their client and proposed for transfer to a psychological care institution instead of the Female Social Rehabilitation Center where she had been sent. The forensic clinical psychologist stated that Kathleen might exhibit psychopathic traits and signs of schizophrenia. However, since she acted with clear intent and conscience, she wasn't exempt from legal responsibility. She had meticulously planned everything, showing premeditation and malice when committing the crime. Before becoming the center of attention, Yair told the public prosecutor's office that he had known Kathleen Layana for 3 years and had a romantic relationship with her for 2 years. He mentioned ending the relationship due to her possessive nature, recalling an instance where she threatened him with scissors, warning him not to message any female friends. Yair also reported that on Wednesday, October 3, 2018, Kathleen called him asking if he had a machete. When he inquired about its purpose, she claimed it was to clear some shrubs outside her house. Later that afternoon, he received a message from Kathleen saying she needed to leave as someone was looking to kill her. This was the account Jair shared with the public prosecutor before becoming a prime suspect himself. Not long after, the police sought him out for questioning. Veronica Silva's mother acknowledged that while nothing could bring her daughter back, she took solace in knowing that her daughter's killer would serve a significant sentence for the heinous act. To her, justice had been served. She emphasized the need to apprehend Yair, who was on the run, and also who she believed also had a hand in her daughter's murder. On October 6, 2018, Veronica Silva's funeral was held. Her head was adorned with a white lace crown, making her look like a sleeping maiden. During the funeral, the song Amor Eterno by Juan Gabriel played. Her mother was inconsolable, speaking to Veronica through the glass of the casket, pleading for her to look back. Maria's grief was palpable, screaming as she refused to let go of her daughter. It was a loss she would never overcome, forever scarring her life. Maria repeatedly expressed that her daughter, a calm and peaceful young woman, didn't deserve such a brutal, horrific end. After all, who does? In September 2021, the National Police confirmed the arrest of Yair Alexander Boorks Bastidas. He is believed to be the second individual involved in the murder of his girlfriend. In a small American town called Bristol, Tennessee, Johnia Berry was born on August 26, 1983. She was a happy and friendly person who had many friends and loved to have fun at parties. When she was in school, she was also part of the local cheerleading team. After finishing high school, Johnia went to East Tennessee State University to study psychology and criminology. During her college years, she met Jason White, and they became a couple, eventually getting engaged right before they graduated. In late 2004, when she was 21 years old, Johnia decided to get a master's degree in psychology. This led her to move temporarily to Knoxville, another city, for her studies. While studying, she worked part-time at a children's educational center and discovered her passion for helping children. Her boyfriend, Jason, continued his studies in a different state, working towards a law degree. Even though they were far apart, they stayed in touch and planned their wedding. In Knoxville, Johnia initially stayed in her friend Jason Amami's apartment. They both went to college together and later moved to Knoxville. They shared an apartment with 2 bedrooms, and Jason let Johnia stay there until she found her own place. Johnia had 2 part-time jobs, one at a jewelry store and the other at a children's hospital. On the Sunday night of December 5th, after finishing work at the store, Johnia went to the mall to do some Christmas shopping. When she got back home, she wrapped presents for the children at the educational center, talked to her neighbor, and then went to her room. She also spoke to her boyfriend on the phone before going to bed. Around 4 in the morning, Jason Amami heard a scream from a woman. He thought Johnia was having a bad dream, so he went to her room. But instead, he found a stranger with a knife. The stranger attacked Jason, and they had a fight. Eventually, Jason managed to push the attacker away and ran out of the apartment. He went to the nearest convenience store, which was almost a kilometer away, to call for help. When the store clerk saw Jason, who was covered in blood, they called 911. Jason explained what had happened to the police when they arrived. The police went to their apartment and found Johnia in the hallway that connected 5 apartments. She was still alive but barely conscious. When they asked her about the attacker, she could only give weak clues. The police searched the whole building and the area nearby, but they couldn't find the attacker. They rushed Johnia to the nearest hospital, but the doctors couldn't save her, even though they tried their best. The doctor said she had more than 20 stab wounds, and it was very unlikely she could survive. As for Jason, he had 8 wounds from the attacker, but only one was very serious. He got medical help, and his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, the detectives started to investigate the crime scene. They found blood in the hallway, showing that Johnia had tried to ask her neighbors for help, but no one had opened their doors. Right next to Johnia's room, they found the murder weapon, which turned out to be a kitchen knife that belonged to Jason. The attacker had used it with such force that it got bent and damaged. The police also found blood near the back door of the apartment and on the stairs leading to the street. Since Jason and Johnia had left through the front door, the detectives thought the most likely explanation was that the killer had escaped through the back door. In Jason's room, they discovered another clue, a partial footprint, which the attacker might have left when he followed Jason and attacked him. Because of the brutal way the attacker had taken Johnia's life, the police suspected that the motive behind the crime was personal. At first, the detectives started looking into Johnia's boyfriend, even though he was far away, about 1,000 kilometers from Knoxville. But all his friends and family said that Johnia and her boyfriend had a wonderful relationship, and he had no reason to commit such a cruel crime. He found out about Johnia's death when her mother called him at 10 in the morning. He said that after hearing the news, he fainted and took a long time to recover. He was in no condition to do anything, so he had to ask his neighbor to help him book a plane ticket and pack his suitcase. The investigators carefully checked his alibi and realized that he couldn't have physically traveled to Knoxville and back by morning. So, they ruled him out as a suspect and turned their attention to Johnia's neighbor instead. In contrast to the victim's boyfriend, this neighbor had no solid alibi and had been inside the apartment with her, raising suspicions that he might be the culprit. Friends and family of Johnia were also skeptical of him. Some believed he could be the likely killer, while others accused him of fleeing the apartment, leaving Johnia behind. This suspicion ran so deep that the victim's parents didn't even want him to attend her funeral. Shortly after Jason was released from the hospital, investigators began questioning him. He stuck to his initial account. He heard screams, saw an unfamiliar man, and was attacked. After managing to fend off the attacker, Jason rushed to the front door and out into the street, seeking help from the neighbors. He believed that Johnia had also managed to escape the apartment because he couldn't hear her screams. However, the police had reservations about accepting this version of events. What initially raised doubts about Jason were his injuries. 7 of the 8 wounds were superficial, and the last one on his right arm could have been acquired either while defending himself or during an attack. Additionally, investigators found no signs of forced entry into the apartment, suggesting that the person responsible might have been inside already. Jason claimed that he had taken out the trash through the back door that night, but couldn't remember if he had locked it or not. Detectives continued to press him, paying close attention to which door he used to exit the apartment onto the street. Jason insisted that he had left through the front door, but the police suspected he might be lying. If Jason had indeed exited through the back door, it would explain the presence of bloodstains near the door leading to the stairs, further raising suspicions against him. Moreover, the police accused him of using and selling illegal drugs and of being aggressive when he couldn't get his fix. The young man denied all these allegations, but investigators continued to level various charges against him. After several hours at the police station, the detectives proposed a polygraph test of him. Surprisingly, Jason agreed. The investigators brought in an expert who asked him leading questions, and at the end of the session, they informed him that he had failed the test, indicating that he was providing false answers. Upon hearing this, Jason became emotionally distraught, shouting that he had nothing to do with the crime, that his life was in danger, and that the real criminal was still on the loose. However, the detectives remained unconvinced. Nevertheless, they couldn't charge him with the murder due to the lack of concrete evidence. They had to wait for laboratory experts to complete their examination of the few pieces of evidence found in the apartment, and an unexpected twist soon emerged. During their analysis of the murder weapon, the knife, they discovered 3 DNA samples, those of the deceased girl, Jason, and an unidentified man. Additionally, the unknown man's DNA was found in Johnia's room, on the back door handle, and on the staircase used by the criminal to exit onto the street. Furthermore, they uncovered a fingerprint on the knife handle, marked by the victim's blood, that did not match Jason's fingerprint. These discoveries led the police to doubt that Jason was the murderer. The evidence strongly indicated that another person had been in the apartment that night. However, when they checked the DNA sample against existing databases, they found no matches. Even though investigators had ruled out Jason as a suspect, public opinion continued to cast doubt on him, accusing him of leaving his girlfriend behind and fleeing instead of protecting her. Furthermore, Jason started experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. A significant development soon came to light. It was revealed that the polygraph operator had misinterpreted the test results, and there was no indication that Jason was lying. Additionally, there was no concrete evidence linking the young man to illegal substances. It had been used as leverage, but more importantly, the severity of Jason's injuries had been initially underestimated. In reality, Jason had suffered serious damage to his lung and neck, with little hope for a full recovery. Due to these inaccuracies in police reports, the insurance company only covered 25% of his treatment costs, leaving Jason facing severe financial hardship. Once the police no longer considered him a suspect, they began questioning Jason as a witness. From his account, they managed to create a rough description of the attacker. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jason hadn't gotten a clear look at the assailant's face. The apartment was dimly lit, and the attacker had pounced on him as soon as he exited the room. The investigators also stumbled upon something intriguing in Johnia's room: a cap, along with discs, and a stereo player near the back staircase. Initially, they thought these items might belong to either the victim or Jason, but Jason denied any connection to them. According to him, none of these items were in his apartment, suggesting they were left behind by the killer. The investigators shared a rough sketch of the suspect with the media, and after it was publicized, the police received hundreds of leads. People reported individuals who vaguely resembled the sketch, prompting detectives to pursue each of these leads. One lead stood out to the investigators. They learned about a group of teenagers in the area who had been breaking into houses with the intent to steal. One of these teenagers, a 19-year-old named Michael, bore a resemblance to the suspect's sketch. The police initiated a search for him, which was complicated because he was already wanted for theft. Now, with the possibility of his involvement in a murder, 2 police units joined the search for Michael. They eventually located him and brought him in for questioning. The investigators immediately focused on Michael's shoes, which had a tread pattern similar to the footprint left by the killer. They collected a DNA sample and fingerprints from Michael and sent them to the experts for analysis. Meanwhile, they interrogated him, and during this process, they received an unexpected revelation. Michael quickly admitted that he and a friend had indeed entered Johnia's apartment that night. According to his account, they had planned to steal valuable items, but his friend had taken a knife and attacked Johnia. However, the detectives soon began to doubt Michael's story. Firstly, the details he provided didn't align with the actual events. Secondly, there was no evidence of the presence of two strangers at the crime scene. The laboratory results further confirmed their skepticism. Michael's DNA and fingerprints did not match those found at the murder scene. The same held true for his shoes. The tread pattern did not match the one in Jason's room. Ultimately, the police concluded that Michael had fabricated the story. While it may sound unusual, such false admissions occur relatively frequently in high-profile cases. Some individuals falsely claim guilt for various reasons, including seeking attention or hoping for a reward for information. It remains unclear what motivated Michael, but his story turned out to be entirely untrue. Following that, investigators interviewed over 1,000 potential suspects and gathered around 400 DNA samples, but none of them matched the evidence. Early in the investigation, a reward had been offered for information leading to the case's resolution. As each month passed, the reward amount increased, and by December 2005, 1 year after the murder, it had reached $60,000. Adding to this, the state governor chipped in an additional $20,000 from his own funds, drawing even more public attention to the case. Despite the abundance of leads, all of them eventually led to dead ends, and the case remained unsolved for several years. In 2007, the victims' parents decided to take action by seeking changes in state legislation. They found it perplexing that the fingerprints and DNA of the murderer were not in any databases. Given the brutality of the crime, the parents refused to believe it was the perpetrator's first offense. They later discovered that, according to Tennessee laws, fingerprints and DNA samples were only collected from convicted criminals. Johnia's parents were determined to change this. They played an active role in crafting a new law that mandated the collection of these samples from all individuals arrested for violent crimes. Authorities supported this initiative, and the law was enacted in May 2007. 2 months later, a breakthrough occurred in the case. The police arrested Taylor Lee Olsen, a 22-year-old, for violating the terms of his probation. Olsen had a long history of criminal activities, primarily involving theft, check forgery, and auto theft, and he had been arrested multiple times before. Surprisingly, his fingerprints and DNA had never been collected, even though he had a history of run-ins with the law. Olsen lived with his girlfriend and their newborn daughter, but his criminal activities persisted. It was revealed that Olsen had already come to the investigators' attention 5 months earlier when they received a tip about his possible involvement in the murder. However, for reasons unknown, the police had not pursued DNA samples for analysis at that time. Nevertheless, with his new arrest for probation violation, they finally decided to question him about Johnia's case. Olsen eventually confessed his involvement in the murder and willingly provided a DNA sample. When the lab results came in, it was confirmed that Taylor's DNA was a complete match with the sample found in the victim's apartment. Following this, they collected his fingerprints, which also matched the fingerprint on the murder weapon. Olsen was subsequently arrested, and detectives began to question him. Initially, Olsen said he was not guilty, but he eventually decided to confess to his actions. Taylor claimed that on that night, he had intended to steal Johnia's car and had entered her apartment through the back door to find the car keys. When he entered her room, she woke up and began screaming. In response, Olsen grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her multiple times. However, he insisted that he hadn't intended to kill anyone, and it had all occurred accidentally. Detectives had doubts about the truthfulness of some details and leaned towards believing that Taylor had premeditated the murder. It was possible that he had been stalking the victim for some time, indirectly supported by the fact that Johnia's friends had reported someone following her in a car. At the time, no evidence was found to substantiate this, but after Olsen's arrest, it seemed increasingly plausible. Despite this, there was little doubt about his culpability. His DNA and fingerprints were present on the murder weapon, strongly indicating his involvement. Olsen's trial was slated to commence in mid-2008, and by that point, he had already retained a lawyer. Apparently, his legal counsel advised him to retract his confession, and Taylor presented a new version of events to the detectives. Now, he claimed that he had entered Johnia's apartment with his friend named Noah Cox. According to this revised account, when Olsen entered Johnia's room to retrieve the car keys, she allegedly woke up, seized a knife, and stabbed him several times. Olsen then fled through the back door, while his friend entered Johnia's room, disarmed her, and killed her. This new narrative raised suspicions among the police. They found no fingerprints or DNA from other individuals at the crime scene, making it appear unlikely that anyone else was involved. Detectives awaited the start of the trial, but it never occurred. On March 28, 2008, Taylor Olsen took his own life in his prison cell. Alongside him, several suicide notes were discovered, addressed to his family, Johnia's relatives, and the police. In the note to the detectives, he once again alleged that his friend Noah Cox was the actual perpetrator and also apologized to Johnia's family and his own. Detectives continued to believe that Olsen was responsible for the murder and repeatedly questioned Noah. However, they found no evidence implicating him. Johnia's parents also remained skeptical, believing that Olsen was lying. In their view, if Taylor was truly innocent, he wouldn't have taken his own life. It seemed more likely that he simply did not want to spend the rest of his life in prison. Furthermore, for several months following his initial confession, Olsen had consistently maintained that he had entered the apartment alone and that there was no one else with him. The sudden change in his story to shift blame onto his friend raised further doubts. Vicki Glass was born on September 21, 1979, in Stockton-on-Tees, a trading town situated on the banks of the River Tees. At that time, it was part of the extinct county of Cleveland, later reassigned the county of Durham in England. She was the daughter of Deborah and Anthony Glass and had an older sister named Claire, who was a year older than her. Vicki entered the world prematurely, weighing less than 3.3 pounds, and both her life and her mother's were in danger. Eventually, Vicki's parents separated, and when she was 6 years old, her mother remarried Colin Goodall, a man also living in Stockton-on-Tees. This new union gave the young girl an additional stepsister named Cheryl, who was older than her, and a younger brother named Thomas. From that point on, Vicki lived with them. Vicki had light skin, light brown eyes, and long hair, a look she maintained from childhood into adolescence when she decided to cut her hair. Despite being born with a hearing impairment, music was Vicki's passion, and she considered herself a huge fan of Michael Jackson. Her musical inclination led her to join the local jazz band at a very young age. Clearly, she was a determined young lady. She remained with the group from the ages of 13 to 18, during which time she always enjoyed the trips they took to perform in various places. According to her acquaintances, she felt proud when she performed. Vicki also had a deep love for animals, particularly cats. In fact, she rescued one which she named Sooty. Vicki attended Blakestone High School, also located in Stockton-on-Tees, and had a keen interest in running and sports in general. However, she was very diligent and never neglected her studies. Later on, she secured a job at a local factory in Teesside. While some people who knew her saw Vicki as a quiet and somewhat shy girl, her family and closest friends knew her to be very cheerful. They said she had a heart of gold and was very affectionate. She was indeed a much-loved person who seemingly had everything and lived in a healthy and happy environment. Unfortunately, her life took a dramatic turn when she was nearing her 18th birthday. According to her mother, she began associating with the wrong crowd and started using drugs. The young woman became addicted to heroin and became so dependent on narcotics that she started offering sex services to support her addiction, eventually leading her to leave her home. Over time, Vicki began frequenting the suburbs of Middlesbrough, about 8 kilometers to the east of Stockton-on-Tees, particularly a truck parking lot where transport companies used to park their vehicles overnight. By December 1999, Vicki had developed a chest condition and was homeless. Through a friend, she met a man who lived in Middlesbrough, who offered her shelter while she recovered her health. The homeowner took care of her, and the place became her permanent residence. He assisted her in scheduling her medical appointments and ensured she didn't miss them. Despite the man's efforts to help the girl heal and improve her life, she continued with her addiction to illegal substances and continued offering her services as a sex worker. In the year 2000, Vicki continued with the same lifestyle, and so her 21st birthday arrived on September 21. Unfortunately, the joy quickly turned into tragedy. According to case reports, on that Thursday night, the young woman worked and also celebrated. Apparently, Friday, the 22nd, passed without incident, and by Saturday, the 23rd, Vicki went to her home in the company of a friend to change clothes. Around noon, both of them left the place. Hours later, past midnight, Vicki met with a client on Borough Road, located in the center of Middlesbrough. They then went to 104 Princes Road, a place frequented by drug users and sex workers. She was dressed in a white shirt, light gray pants, and white sneakers. Some time later, the young woman and her client took a taxi down on Union Street and went back to this male's home in Norton, Stockton. After spending some time there, Vicki called a taxi line she often used. The driver picked her up at around 4 a.m. on Sunday, September 24, and about 20 minutes later, he dropped her off in Middlesbrough, specifically at the junction of Union Street and Eshwood Square. This is just to the rear on a pub that was then called the Shipmate. As soon as the taxi driver dropped the woman off at the designated destination, he returned to the headquarters of the taxi company he worked for. That night, and in the following days, Vicki did not return to her house. Her friend, the man who had helped her when she needed it most, became worried as her absence prolonged. He started asking about her at all the places she frequented. Since no one could provide information about her whereabouts, he decided to contact the police to report her as missing. In the same month, a man named Sean Tooley was arrested. His arrest was related to the asphyxiation death of a 20-year-old woman named Kelly Mallinson, who also engaged in sex work to finance her addiction and frequented the same places Vicki did. Tooley was sentenced to life in prison a year later. On Friday, November 3, 6 weeks after Vicki's disappearance, a man who was walking dogs made a gruesome discovery on a trail in the town of Danby, a picturesque village located in the North Yorkshire. Around 6 in the morning, the man came across the naked and decomposed corpse of a woman. Immediately, amidst his shock, the citizen notified the police. The remains were taken to the coroner's office, where experts determined that it was Vicki. Due to the state of the remains, pathologists concluded that she had been exposed to the moorland winds for several weeks. Although they couldn't establish the cause of her death, they stated that there appeared to be no wounds and no signs of abuse, sexual or otherwise, nor any indication that she had died from drowning. Officials who arrived at the scene searched the area surrounding where Vicki's body was found for clues and tried to locate the victim's clothing, but their efforts yielded no results. Cleveland and North Yorkshire police officers initiated investigations. A team of 40 officers tried to reconstruct the unfortunate young woman's last steps during the night of September 23 and the early hours of September 24. They interviewed both the taxi driver and the employees of the places Vicki frequented, as well as the friend who had given her shelter and some witnesses and colleagues. Sergeant Brian Dunn, who was leading the investigation at that time, made several public appeals for assistance from the community. They needed someone to provide information that could be useful in catching the perpetrator. Vicki's family was devastated by the tragic death of the young woman. On that day, when her mother returned from work, the police were at her house. Her initial reaction was to ask if they had found her daughter and if she was okay, but when she received the news, she began to tremble. Until that moment, she was convinced that her daughter would reappear alive, and every contact she had with the police involved asking if they would help Vicki get off drugs once they found her. On November 13, Vicki's mother, Deborah, lashed out at the press for labeling her daughter as a drug addict. She emphasized that this fact was irrelevant and that the important thing was that she was a 21-year-old girl who had lost her life in a brutal manner. The following week, posters with Vicki's photograph were placed in various locations, especially in the places where the girl had been on the night she disappeared. In that same month of November, the police reported that they had spoken to more than 500 people and had taken statements from 150, including former clients of the young woman, taxi drivers, neighbors, and truck drivers. They also analyzed over 60 hours of closed-circuit camera recordings located in the areas the victim used to frequent. November was passing when Vicki's father, Anthony, and her stepfather, Colin, went together to the site where the lifeless body of the girl was found. On that day, Deborah's absence was notable, but the mother was too affected to participate in the ceremony. In addition to placing flowers, they prayed for any clues or information that would lead to the truth about what had happened. Anthony sent a plea to members of the community to help them find closure. In doing so, he stressed that they only needed a phone call to end the nightmare they were living, not knowing what had happened to their daughter. The investigation focused on the hundreds of truck drivers who used to frequent the parking lot in Middlesbrough. As part of the inquiries, a 39-year-old married man was arrested, but his identity was never revealed. Eventually, his connection to the case was ruled out, and he was released. In January 2002, the investigators in charge of the case arrested a 47-year-old unmarried man, identified as Eric Coates, who resided in North Yorkshire. This was the third time officials had interviewed him in relation to the case, as he had been unable to provide a credible alibi for his whereabouts on the day Vicki disappeared. The agents found it suspicious that he couldn't remember certain details precisely. The man admitted that he had been with sex workers, but denied any involvement in Vicki's death. He also revealed that 1 or 2 girls had mentioned to him that the crime was related to a drug debt settlement. His house, which he shared with his parents, was searched by the police, as were other properties belonging to his family. During the searches, officers seized computer equipment, clothing, diaries, videotapes, and a vehicle. Additionally, this individual had a criminal record. He had been arrested and imprisoned for 15 months in 1994 for unlawfully restraining and assaulting a sex worker in Middlesbrough. However, he was acquitted of charges of attempted sexual assault and indecent assault against the same woman. Ultimately, it was determined that Eric had nothing to do with Vicki's crime, and he was released. His father, a former county councillor in North Yorkshire, stated that they were as interested as the police in finding out who had taken the young woman's life. Years later, in 2006, Eric was imprisoned and sentenced to 14 years for pleading guilty to 15 sexual offenses against girls aged between 11 and 14 years. In this context, it was also revealed that his father had faced 12 charges of sexual offenses, but was not brought to trial due to health reasons. Returning to 2002, in July, Cleveland police questioned a man identified as John Taylor, who was serving a life sentence after pleading guilty to the kidnapping and murder of a 16-year-old girl in Leeds, West Yorkshire. The investigations into John also yielded no results, and he was ruled out as a suspect in the attack on Vicki. In December 2006, detectives from Cleveland police reported that they had contacted their colleagues in Suffolk to explore possible connections between Vicki's case and the tragic deaths of 5 other sex workers. For these crimes, truck driver Steve Wright had been arrested, and 2 years later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Subsequently, the authorities in Cleveland ruled out any connection of the man with the death. When the tragedy reached its 10-year mark, Vicki's parents visited the place where their daughter was found lifeless and placed flowers in her honor. Deborah told reporters that she thought of her daughter every day and that it was a pain that would never go away. In December 2010, the case file was once again examined, searching for possible links, such as a man identified as Stephen Griffiths, who had taken the lives of 3 sex workers in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, at the beginning of January 2011, any possible connection to Vicki's disappearance was ruled out. For the family, the pain of loss was compounded by the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to her and the belief that the person responsible for her death remained at large. Vicki's grandmother, who was very close to the girl, was deeply affected and passed away a year later. Her mother, Deborah, passed away in 2015 at the age of 55 without ever getting to know the person who took her daughter's life. Anthony later admitted that during the first 24 months after the tragedy, he couldn't work and lost his job. He confessed that he couldn't smile, and it took him a long time to regain belief in himself and convince himself that it wasn't his fault. In 2017, the Cleveland police requested a grant to fund 3 separate historic cases in the vicinity of Middlesbrough. A year later, the Home Office agreed to provide approximately £3.7 million, about $4.6 million at the current exchange rate, to fund the Historic Investigation Unit aimed at thoroughly reviewing unsolved cases. In addition to Vicki's case, officials also reopened the cases of Donna Keogh, who disappeared in 1998 at the age of 17, and Rachel Wilson, who disappeared in 2002, with her body being located in a ditch 10 years later. There were some similarities in these cases, such as the age and occupation of the victims, and the fact that all 3 occurred in Middlesbrough. In October 2018, a website published information that rekindled hopes of uncovering the truth about Vicki's death. The news referred to a high-profile convicted offender. The inmate had been a taxi driver and was responsible for ending the life of a 22-year-old office worker who went missing in March 2011, and her remains were found in a grave. According to the media report, at the time of his arrest, the man confessed to the murder of another young woman, age 20, committed 8 years earlier, and he provided information about the location of the body. However, no connection between the criminal and Vicki's case could be established. In September 2021, the police announced that they had significant new lines of investigation regarding the unsolved case. In this context, they made a fresh public appeal, urging anyone who knew any details about what might have happened to Vicki in 2000 to contact the authorities. The officers expressed hope because they now had more modern forensic techniques and plans to interview potential witnesses and examine over 2,000 hours of CCTV footage. During this time, one of the detectives on the case mentioned that in the preceding 12 months, a lot of work had been done on Vicki's case. He explained that a detailed review of the original investigation had resulted in 300 recommendations, with the primary one being to initiate a new investigation, leveraging advancements in forensic science. In the same year, the case of Rachel, mentioned earlier, was closed with the arrest of a 62-year-old man identified as Keith Hall, who was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 2022, the investigators leading the case appealed to the community to collaborate by providing any information that could be helpful in solving the mystery surrounding Vicki's death. They were particularly interested in identifying the truck driver who was seen with the young woman hours before her disappearance. To achieve this goal, they released CCTV images in which Vicki is seen walking with a man in a parking lot on the night of her disappearance. And later, she is seen conversing with a truck driver to whom she may have left some of her belongings. This latter man was described as an individual with white skin, broad shoulders, aged between 34 and 38, and having a distinctive mark on his face. The police also launched a website with Vicki's name in an effort to gather information about the case. As part of these initiatives, detectives spoke with hundreds of people, and while they collected a significant amount of information, the identity of the truck driver remains unknown. That year, the family issued a statement reaffirming their deep love for Vicki and the difficult times they were going through. They emphasized that Deborah, Vicki's mother, passed away without answers, knowing that the person who took her daughter's life was still on the streets. On November 3, 2023, 23 years had passed since Vicki's lifeless body was found, and the investigation to find the person responsible for her death is one of the most extensive in the history of Cleveland police in England. Each year that goes by without justice is another year of suffering for the relatives of Vicki Glass, who would be 44 years old today. The police stated that in order to provide closure to the family, they need the support of the community. They are confident that someone out there possesses the missing piece to solve the puzzle and expressly called on that person to come forward to the authorities to help uncover the truth. Shelby Erin Von Holt was a cheerful young girl born on September 7, 2000, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, USA. Shelby was the second child in a family that included her mother, Shauna Hartman, father Tody Von Holt, older sister Peyton Hartman, and younger siblings Devin Von Holt and Isaac Von Holt. Shelby graduated from Troy Center High School in 2018. Over the next 2 years, she worked at a steakhouse and other places while contemplating her desired career path. She seemed to be leaning towards a therapeutic field, although she hadn't yet decided the exact specialty. Living life like any other 20-year-old, Shelby's cheerful personality made her the life of every party. She was ever smiling, loved to dance, sing, and spend time with friends. Interestingly, Shelby was living independently, although the reasons or circumstances for this remain unclear. Although she wasn't particularly active on most social media platforms, her presence on Facebook was notable. She frequently posted cheerful photos, many of which included moments shared with her young niece, Camila, the daughter of her older sister, Peyton. According to her mother, Shelby met another young woman named Valerie Rose Hardik on Facebook. Though Valerie, at 22, was slightly older, the two reportedly never had a close relationship. Little is known about Valerie's life, but it has been rumored that she had a troubled childhood, questionable associations, and potentially some mental health challenges. On June 20, 2021, at 6:48 p.m., a 911 dispatcher received a call from a distressed woman. She managed to convey that she was injured and said that Valerie shot her. Whether she provided her address or if the police traced the call is unclear. However, shortly after, officers from the Fort Wayne Police Department arrived at a residence where Shelby resided. Upon arriving at the scene, officers forced entry into the residence and found Shelby barely conscious, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, surrounded by a substantial pool of blood. While one officer stayed with Shelby, the rest performed what is termed a protective sweep of the residence to ensure no other victims were present and that the assailant or assailants were not still inside. As they awaited the arrival of an ambulance and local firefighters, the officers attempted to provide first aid. A sergeant asked Shelby if she knew who had shot her. She identified Valerie as the perpetrator of the attack. Soon after, emergency medical personnel took over Shelby's primary care, rushing her to the nearby hospital. She was conscious, in critical condition, but still alive. Meanwhile, Shelby's family was informed of the incident, and Fort Wayne Police Department officers began gathering potential evidence from her home. A significant piece of this evidence was a doorbell camera. After an immediate review of its footage, a person of interest was identified, though details were not publicly disclosed at the time. A public appeal was made, urging anyone with pertinent information related to the case to contact the police department or provide details anonymously through Crime Stoppers. In a twist of fate, the day after Shelby was critically injured, a disturbing incident occurred roughly 50 kilometers away in Ohio. Around 10:30 in the morning, the local police department received several calls about a suspicious-looking young woman loitering around a convenience store situated at a gas station. Eyewitnesses claim she had been wandering inside the store and near the gas pumps for about an hour, appearing to try and glimpse the credit card numbers customers were using for their purchases. But that wasn't all. The police county had already received a call from a man who reported the same woman seen earlier at the convenience store. He claimed she had pointed a gun at his back. Shortly after, with precautions taken, police officers arrived at the gas station where the woman was still present, and they proceeded to apprehend her without any violent incidents. The woman was identified as 22-year-old Valerie Rose Hardik. She was in possession of a 9mm handgun, which according to reports matched the weapon used in the assault on Shelby. The name Valerie was the one uttered by Shelby when identifying her attacker. To further solidify the suspicions, Valerie's car was the same one captured by Shelby's doorbell camera, seen leaving the scene moments before the injured young woman's emergency call. Despite the ongoing investigation, Valerie was booked and transferred to the county correctional facility, awaiting her arraignment in the local municipal court. Meanwhile, Shelby was desperately clinging to life. 8 9mm bullet wounds had severely injured her chest and abdomen. Doctors had placed her in an induced coma, doing everything in their power to save her. Regrettably, 3 days after the brutal attack, on June 22, 2021, Shelby's body succumbed to the injuries, and she was declared dead. According to media reports, Shauna, Shelby's mother, mentioned her daughter passed away after undergoing 4 intricate abdominal surgeries that didn't produce the hoped-for outcomes. Shelby received 20 blood transfusions, and the medical prognosis was always grim. If she had survived, doctors believed that Shelby's legs would need to be amputated. One might wonder what could drive a 22-year-old woman to murder another young woman so viciously. Based on the limited details, the only motive the investigators disclosed was jealousy. It was alleged that Shelby was dating a young man to whom Valerie had a strong attachment, although his identity was never revealed. Valerie was charged with criminal assault and aggravated threats. Initially detained in Ohio, she was set a bail of $100,000 for threatening a man at the gas station with a firearm. After the initial legal proceedings in Ohio, Valerie was transferred to Allen County to face charges for the murder of Shelby. In a private ceremony, Shelby Von Holt's remains were memorialized at a funeral home on June 29, 2021, after which they were cremated. As the judicial process for the murder unfolded at the beginning of 2022, Valerie Rose Hardik entered a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to the murder of Shelby, citing a mental illness as a defense. As part of the agreement, the prosecution dropped an aggravating charge related to the use of a firearm during the commission of the crime, which could have added an additional 20 years to her sentence. Having pleaded guilty, the sentencing hearing was the only step left. This took place in September 2022 in the Superior Court of Allen County. As agreed, Valerie entered her plea as guilty but mentally ill. During the hearing, Valerie's defense attorney tried to present mitigating circumstances. He detailed Valerie's challenging upbringing, marked by the death of her stepmother, abuse from a stepbrother, and a history of mental health issues. However, the prosecutors highlighted the trivial motive of jealousy that led Valerie to take Shelby's life. The prosecution also emphasized Valerie's criminal history, noting its escalation over time. They pointed out that when Valerie murdered Shelby, she was on probation, part of an alternative program due to previous charges. Throughout the hearing, Valerie displayed erratic behavior. At times, she appeared coherent and fully aware of the situation, while at other moments she seemed nervous, distracted, and even smiled at Shelby's family. Still, she answered the court's questions accurately. Media reports did not specify exactly what Valerie said when given the chance to speak, but they did highlight that she never showed remorse or apologized to Shelby's family. Shelby's parents, however, clearly conveyed their profound loss during their victim impact statements. Shelby's father recalled his daughter's love for significant symbols like peace signs and mentioned that at the time of her murder, she was finding her way in life. He reflected on Valerie's demeanor during her guilty plea, stating that just by hearing her voice, one could sense her lack of remorse. The grief-stricken father asserted that by admitting to intentionally killing Shelby, Valerie wore her crime like a badge of honor, which showed clear evidence of her lack of regret. Additionally, Toby stated that while jealousy was presented as Valerie's motivation for killing Shelby, he believed there had to be more to the story that wasn't revealed. Referring to the defense's argument about Valerie's mental illness, Shelby's father pointed out that prisons are filled with people with mental issues. He vowed never to stop seeking answers as to why this tragedy occurred. In a heartfelt reflection, Toby emphasized that there were two tragedies in this case, the first being the shocking and agonizing death of his daughter, and the second being Valerie's choice to forsake her future out of rage. He pointed out that Valerie's children would suffer greatly. It was revealed that at 22, Valerie already had at least 2 children, though no further details about them were made public. The grieving father expressed that the tragedy wouldn't end at the graveyard or in the courtroom, stating that true justice could never be found in such tragedy. However, he shared that he had forgiven Valerie to find peace within himself, feeling that his faith in Christ guided him to this decision. He expressed confidence that Shelby was with God and reiterated his deep love for her. Shauna, Shelby's mother, also shared her sentiments. She fondly remembered her daughter as a princess from the day she was born. She described Shelby as a kind spirit who wouldn't hesitate to help a friend, no matter the distance. Shauna committed to attending all possible appeal hearings that Valerie's defense might initiate in the future. Shauna shared the torment of the memory of her lifeless daughter and the helplessness she felt being unable to protect her. All she could do was lay her head on Shelby's chest as her daughter lay in a medically induced coma. She publicly acknowledged her daughter's courage, as Shelby had managed to name her assailant twice and fought valiantly for her life after being attacked. Shauna detailed Shelby's severe injuries, explaining that her heart was racing so fast that her body couldn't sustain it. Shauna mentioned she didn't seek compensation for her daughter's medical expenses, which amounted to merely $500,000, as these were waived upon Shelby's death. Funeral expenses were around $15,000, but Shanna expressed that she didn't believe she would ever receive compensation and didn't want any money from Valerie. Holding back tears, Shelby's mother expressed that memories were all she had left. She wished she could trade places with her daughter, noting that there were days when the grief was so intense that she couldn't bring herself to get up. After the presentations by the legal representatives and the victims' family statements, the court awaited the verdict from the judge. Given the plea agreement under Indiana law, the sentence could range between a minimum of 45 years to a maximum of 65 years, with the average being 55 years. Valerie's defense asked for the minimum sentence, highlighting various mitigating factors, while the prosecution sought the maximum. Before announcing his decision, the judge stated it was evident the murder was premeditated and Valerie was fully aware of her actions, which was further evident when she fled to Ohio. The judge acknowledged that Valerie might have had a challenging upbringing, facing inadequate education, personal traumas, and mental health issues. However, he emphasized her growing criminal record. At the time of Shelby's murder, Valerie was already facing pending charges for a separate crime. Given her past unsuccessful rehabilitation attempts and criminal background, her trauma couldn't be deemed a viable excuse. Reflecting on these points, the judge sentenced 23-year-old Valerie to the maximum possible sentence of 65 years in prison. He also ordered the destruction of the weapon used in the murder. According to the American Correctional System's records, Valerie is incarcerated in Indiana Women's Prison, with the earliest estimated release date being June 18, 2070, at which time she will be 72 years old. After the court session, Shelby's parents expressed satisfaction with the verdict. However, in later statements, they clarified that no judgment could alleviate their pain. While Valerie would spend her days in prison, Shelby's mother emphasized that she would forever miss and remember her daughter. Interestingly, this case is one of the few where a mortal victim was able to identify her killer. Elaborating on this aspect, a prosecutor, who was not involved in this case, explained that when a dying victim identifies their attacker, such statements are known as dying declarations. These not only provide a starting point for detectives, but also stand as the sole exception to the hearsay rule in court trials, aiming to ensure the most reliable evidence is presented. He also stressed that such dying declarations are admissible in court since they tend to produce more trustworthy statements due to the immense pressure and tragic circumstances surrounding them. Elliot Rodger was born on July 24, 1991, in London, England. His parents were Peter Rodger and Lee Chin Rodger, both very young at the time of conceiving the child, and while growing their professional careers, Peter was dedicated to photography, dreamed of becoming a renowned filmmaker in Hollywood. Lee Chin was a young woman from Malaysia who had come to the United Kingdom to work as a nurse on film sets. Thanks to her job, she had the necessary contacts to fantasize about the idea of moving the family to the United States, where big dreams come true. George Lucas, no less, was a close friend of Lee Chin. In the years following after Elliot's birth, the family prepared for the big move, and after the arrival of their fourth member, Georgia, in 1996, they finally embarked on the journey that changed their lives. That year, the four of them took their belongings and settled in California, close to movie stars and huge recording studios. A new chapter in the life of the Rodgers began. However, not everyone was pleased with this change. For the first time, sadness appeared within Elliot. For him, the happy days had been left behind in London. But after a brief period of adaptation, he was ready to become the happy child he once was. when it was time to start at his new school, his limited social skills became evident. Elliot was extremely shy and rarely had the courage to approach other children, to start a conversation or join a game. In these situations, it was his mother who intervened and invited some classmates over to play at the house. Then, everything would go normally, and Elliot seemed to integrate easily. Although there were numerous moves, after a while, the Rodgers found their place and began to form bonds in the country they had arrived in. The adults had their friends, their dream jobs. Elliot was doing well in school. Everything seemed to be going as planned. But the dream was short-lived. By the time Elliot turned 7, the fights between Peter and Li Chin became more frequent. The situation became unbearable, and after a few months, the couple decided to separate. This event significantly affected Elliot's emotions and behavior. The child began to feel resentment towards his father, especially when, shortly after, he introduced him to his new girlfriend. He couldn't believe what he was doing to his mother. He refused to go to his father's house because he was hardly ever there, and he had to spend time with his father's new girlfriend, whom Elliot felt was trying to impose rules as if she had authority over him. But other, more important issues were on his mind, and soon his parents' breakup became a secondary concern. What really obsessed him was figuring out how to make friends and be seen as a popular kid. He observed from a distance the behavior of the classmates he admired, wanting to emulate their appearance so others would notice him. Until that point, he had felt invisible everywhere except at home. At home, his mother indulged all his wishes and whims, but outside, he felt that no one acknowledged his existence. He did everything within his power to change this, seeing that his father, a good and successful man, had quickly found a new woman. Elliot concluded that this was the way to stand out among people and eventually become a great seducer. He asked his parents for permission to dye his hair blonde, changed his outfits to urban clothes, like those worn by skaters, bought a skateboard, and started practicing. His plan seemed to be working. For the first time, he felt he could find a group of friends on his own, without the need to talk too much. But at the same time, he was not so good with physical skills. There was always someone better than him. This discovery filled him with hatred. This was the first time he began to experience envy and jealousy. Others seemed to fit perfectly into the world, but for him, it seemed an impossible task to accomplish. Unfortunately, this thought began to completely take over his mind, plunging him into a vicious cycle of resentment. By the time he reached adolescence, his obsession took another turn. The idea of getting a girlfriend and losing his virginity began to occupy his head all day. He knew that day would come. Each day, his group of friends demanded him to do something he didn't want to do. He himself claimed that he was desperate to catch the attention of women, to receive the love that had been denied to him so far, to lose the virginity that made him look as a loser. Time kept passing, and he was still unable to achieve his goal. He couldn't understand why women didn't notice him, why they didn't choose him and preferred to go out with unoriginal boys, only dating good-looking guys whom he considered stereotypes. After constant frustrations, which accumulated from failed attempts to relate to other people, he immersed himself in the world of video games. There, he found an escape from the harsh reality he faced daily. He distanced himself from the few friends he had managed to make with the help of his mother, and fully delved into the parallel universe of role-playing games, losing interest in everything else. At school, they began to bully him for being the quiet and calm boy, and also mocked him for his fear of talking to women. When the situation became unbearable, his parents decided to change his school. However, this measure turned out to be even worse, as he was sent to a school with a larger number of students than the previous one, which caused him overwhelming anxiety. At that establishment, he also suffered bullying from his classmates. He then begged his parents not to send him back to that place. Complying with his request, they decided to send him to a smaller part-time institution. Elliot felt more comfortable there, but still, none of his classmates were to his liking. The hatred for people was already entrenched in him. He saw himself as superior to others, who were incapable of noticing him. For this reason, he believed he was doomed to a lonely and miserable life, while other boys his age lived their lives fully, partying, having intimate relationships, and socializing with friends. The envy and jealousy he had begun to feel during his childhood took over his body, filling him with fury and hatred towards all humanity. These thoughts led to several episodes of crying where he expressed being fed up with his life. The experiences that had led him to constant frustration and the new family his father had formed eventually plunged him into a deep depression. Although he refused to leave his room, his parents decided to take him to a psychiatrist. The professional prescribed medication, but Elliot refused to take it, insisting he was not sick. Nevertheless, the first signs that something was not right began to appear. When it was time to go to university, his parents thought it would be a good idea for Elliot to live on the campus of the University of California. Perhaps being away from his family, the boy would find a way to relate to people his age without the intervention of his mother or any other adult. However, once again, the plan did not turn out as expected. Elliot lived with other classmates, but he didn't even engage in conversation with them. He found it impossible to share his space with others. Everything seemed to be an attack on him. Moreover, reality hit him hard again. The city where he lived was full of young people having fun day and night, walking hand in hand with their partners, and he couldn't even approach anyone. He then thought that, although he hated them, the only option to get a girlfriend was to become like one of them. He took advantage of his parents' good economic position to build a personality based on wearing designer clothes, driving a high-end car, and flaunting the money he had to be seen as a sophisticated, cultured, and fascinating man. To do that, he had to become rich, and the easiest way to do it was by betting on lottery tickets. He invested the money his parents sent him, learned gaming strategies, and dedicated his time to achieving his goal. But once again, his plan did not come to fruition. It was impossible for him to contain the rage he felt seeing others have the life he desired and believed he deserved. He then began to frequent websites to learn how to seduce women. By clicking on some alternative links, he arrived at a portal where hundreds of men in the same situation shared their frustration and blamed women for their discomfort. However, he saw these men as losers and did not feel he belonged to that category either. His insistence on fulfilling his win seemed to have no end. On one occasion, learning about a party organized at one of the fraternities, he took the courage to go, even though he had not been invited. Beforehand, he drank vodka in his university room and then went to the place. When he entered the house, he saw people talking among themselves. But once again, they did not notice his presence. He drank a few more glasses there, hoping someone would approach him. Then he noticed an Asian boy having fun, and anger overwhelmed him. He ran towards him and started shouting and insulting him. How was it possible that this Asian boy had friends, and he did not? People mocked him because he was drunk and did not know what he was saying. Then, by his own will, he left that room, went to a balcony, sat down, and watched everyone in solitude, hating them with all his might. Soon, the refuge he had found began to fill with boys and girls. Fury returned, and he started to insult the women, trying to push them off the balcony. However, the boys accompanying them reacted in time, and it was he himself who ended up falling. Injured from the fall, he left the place completely lost in his fury. The next day, he called his father to accompany him to a hospital due to the poor condition of his leg. He invented a story in which he was the victim. This was his breaking point. All the discomfort he had been dragging for years had to be returned to the world and humanity, which had rejected him time and again. He decided he had to take control of the situation. The only way out was revenge. This was how his macabre fantasy took shape and turned into a plan to execute. A plan he called the Day of Retribution. Elliot prepared for months for the day he would finally end his miserable existence. During his time at the university, he had managed to save the money his parents sent him for living expenses to buy weapons that would help him carry out his revenge against humanity. He learned to use them, set a date for the event, and opened a YouTube channel where days before the attack he uploaded videos detailing what he intended to do. He made sure to narrate his day-to-day life and the hatred he felt when he saw couples holding hands or kissing in front of him. He claimed it was a crime that some had that opportunity when he wasn't even looked at. It was an injustice perpetrated by a twisted world and humanity. In the videos, he also showed how he drove around in his luxurious car, and at every corner, he found a party of young people having fun, many girls interacting with boys, and how he insulted and resented them. In his original plan, he included the murder of his stepmother and his younger brother for stealing the life he deserved. The date for this terrible event was initially April 26, 2014, as his father would be out of town. However, a change in Peter's schedule forced Elliot to postpone it for another month. Meanwhile, one of the threatening videos Elliot had uploaded to his blog reached his mother. Concerned about what she had just seen, she alerted the police authorities. 2 officers showed up at the door of the apartment where Elliot lived. The young manipulator appeared calm and friendly enough to convince them that he was fine and would not harm himself or anyone else, considering the possibility of ruining everything he had planned up to that point. Elliot decided to expedite his plan on May 23, 2014. He uploaded his last video, titled The Day of Retribution, and simultaneously sent an email to a dozen acquaintances, including his parents, with a 141-page autobiographical manuscript entitled My Twisted World. In it, he explained the reasons for his hatred towards humanity and justified the horrible actions he was about to commit. His targets were women who chose other men and those men who had the fortune of living the life he believed he deserved. Even in his apartment, he stabbed to death 2 of his roommates and a friend who was visiting them while they were sleeping. He then got into his car and drove to a fraternity, where, according to him, the most beautiful women who had rejected him throughout his life were located. He knocked persistently on the door, but no one opened. He then fired his weapon at a group of girls passing by. 3 of them died instantly, while 1 was injured but survived. Elliot got back into his car and drove through the streets of the city, bringing terror to each person unfortunate enough to cross his path. Passing by a store, he fired his gun numerous times from his car without getting out. Suddenly, the police managed to locate the loose murderer they had been searching for minutes. They began to pursue him, exchanging gunfire. Elliot, out of control, ran over people in his attempt to escape until he was shot in the hip, causing him to crash into a light post. Then, in the immense silence that finally enveloped the terrified city, a final explosion was heard, coming from the interior of the vehicle Elliot was driving. When the officers approached, they found him dead with a head wound. In total, 7 people perished that fateful night, including Elliot Rodger. After the desperation and fear that ran through the blood of the witnesses of the tragic event came desolation. No one could believe what had happened on May 23, 2014. The families of the victims were inconsolable at the fatal end of their loved ones. Even his parents could not comprehend the terrible, drastic decision their son had made. Peter Rodger felt the need to publicly apologize to the relatives, and also assured that they had not been able to see how sick Elliot was, as he had been clever enough to hide most of the thoughts tormenting his mind. Although they were aware of his obsession with getting a girlfriend, he had never expressed the hatred he felt for all humanity. Peter assured that he would live tormented for the rest of his days, knowing that his son took the lives of innocent people due to severe disorders that had not been detected in time. Although they were aware of his obsession with getting a girlfriend, he had never expressed the hatred he felt for all humanity. Peter assured that he would live tormented for the rest of his days, knowing that his son took the lives of innocent people due to severe disorders that had not been detected in time. In this account, Rodger recounted that as soon as his ex-wife received the email containing the manuscript, she called him desperately to warn him that something bad was about to happen. They believed Elliot was going to take his own life. They then drove to meet him and convince him not to do anything rash, but by the time they arrived at the place, the attack had already started, and the news from the police was the death of their son and 6 other people. In an attempt to remedy what Elliot caused, Elliot's parents dedicated their days to joining the fight for improvements in the health system and against gun possession. The case of Elliot Rodger demonstrated that once again, an entire system failed to protect people's integrity. When officers arrived at his apartment, they discovered his collection of knives and other sharp objects, as well as his writings and books about mass murderers. Mental health professionals were also unable to recognize that they were dealing with a severe narcissist, an antisocial person lacking empathy, who endangered his life and others, but they managed to deduce it after his act of revenge. What is even more striking is that while for some, Elliot Rodger was a heartless murderer, for others, he represented someone who did justice for people who feel invisible. Peter Porco and Joan Balzano met in college in the 70s, where he was training to become a lawyer, and she was focusing on studying to become a children's speech pathologist. The young couple was very much in love and decided to start a life together. They married in 1974, and since then, they had settled in a house in Delmar, within Albany County, where they lived for the rest of their lives. Years later, the Porco family grew with the arrival of their first son, Jonathan, in 1981, and 2 years later, in 1983, their second and last son, Christopher, was born. Peter dedicated much of his career to being a prosecutor, but in his later years, when his sons had reached adulthood, he opted for a job that would allow him to be more relaxed and enjoy free time with his wife. Later on, when his eldest son graduated as a sailor and was stationed at the base assigned to him in South Carolina, and the younger Christopher moved to the University of Rochester campus, where he studied biomedical engineering, Peter left the prosecutor's office to start working within the Court of Appeals. By the year 2000, the Porco's place was empty, yet the family never lost contact with each other, especially Christopher, who visited them more regularly because the distance allowed it. However, by the end of 2004, their relationship began to go through a rough patch when Peter and Joan discovered that Christopher was not fully committed to his studies. His grades were not good, he hardly ever attended classes, and he constantly spent time partying with his campus friends. The news disappointed his parents, and as a result, a long argument broke out among them. A week later, in the early hours of November 15, 2004, someone broke into the Porco's house, and the discussion between Peter, Joan, and Christopher was concluded forever. The clock hands pointed to 9 in the morning, marking the time Peter was supposed to go to work. An important day awaited him and his colleagues at the court. Minutes passed, but Peter did not come through the door. His boss began to worry, as it was not common for him to miss work. But if he had reasons to do so, he always notified in advance. Something was wrong, and they had to find out. They called him repeatedly by phone, but in vain, Peter did not answer. Then, his supervisor sent a court security officer to check that everything was all right at the Peters house. The officer arrived at the place around 11 in the morning. From the outside, he could see that something was not right. The key that would open the front door was placed on the outside, but it also had a peculiar detail. It was stained with blood. Without hesitation, he called the supervisor and reported the situation. Both knew something was not right. The supervisor ordered him to enter the house in search of a concrete answer, but first he warned him to be cautious as he did not know what he might find. Just a few steps down the entrance hallway, the officer discovered that he was inside a crime scene. The house was in disarray, and there was no corner that was not stained with blood. A massacre had occurred there. The officer reported the discovery to the police authorities, and they arrived at the scene immediately, launching a large operation at the Porco family home. The police found the place exactly as had been described in the phone call by the informant, following the bloodstains that led them to the main bedroom, where they discovered an even worse scene. On the matrimonial bed lay Joan, Peter's wife, who had also sustained severe injuries from the attacker, with the axe used as a weapon beside her. The scene was dreadful, drenched in blood, and Joan was horrifically disfigured, yet astonishingly, she was alive. Alerting the authorities with a raised hand, the paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital, despite her slim chances of survival. Her injuries were severe. Her skull was fractured, exposing her brain. Her jaw was shattered, and she had lost an eye, rendering her survival nearly impossible. In the ambulance, a case investigator seized the opportunity to question her. Aware of her surroundings yet unable to speak, Joan communicated through head movements. When asked if she recognized the attacker, she nodded. Denying Jonathan as the assailant and confirming Christopher with another nod, her repeated affirmation left no doubt. Christopher, her son, was the attacker. The paramedics, bearing witness to this critical testimony, urged caution in further questioning to prevent jeopardizing her condition. Upon arrival at the hospital, Joan underwent a 12-hour surgery, with her survival far from assured. Meanwhile, investigators, armed with the accused's identity, embarked on a thorough search for evidence to solidify Christopher's guilt. Returning to the crime scene, they meticulously examined every detail, piecing together the sequence of the attack. Initially confused by Peter's body's location near the kitchen on the ground floor, they were astounded by the autopsy results. Peter and his wife were attacked while sleeping, but surprisingly he had survived the initial assault of at least 16 axe wounds, as the injuries did not immediately end his life. Remarkably, on the morning of November 15th, around 5:30 a.m., Peter woke up as if it were any ordinary day, unaware of the gravity of his condition. He proceeded with his morning routine, washing his face and preparing breakfast and lunch for work, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded in his home. He wrote a check to cover the fines that his son Christopher had accumulated due to his reckless driving, and went out to the porch of his house to look for the newspaper. He noticed that the door had closed behind him and he was locked out. Subsequently, he looked for the key he hid among the plants, re-entered the house, and collapsed. His body could no longer withstand it, so he lay down beside the kitchen. Every step, every movement Peter made that morning left large bloodstains, but he was not aware of it. The investigators learned from the autopsy that the axe had caused wounds in the superficial area of the brain, but not in the internal part, where people store activities they frequently do, explaining why he moved normally that morning. On the other hand, the police authorities discovered that the entry had not been forced and that the key they had found on the door was the one Peter had used to re-enter the house, not the attacker. Moreover, the person they were looking for knew the security alarm code that monitored the house, but had taken the trouble to destroy the device. The house was in disarray, drawers open and belongings scattered everywhere, but nothing of value was missing. It was evident that the criminal had staged the scene to simulate a robbery with a fatal outcome. This theory was confirmed when they discovered that a protective metal mesh covering one of the windows from the outside was broken. Trying to open it, they noticed it was locked from the inside and only opened a few inches, making it impossible for a person to escape through there. The attacker had managed to flee the scene without leaving a single footprint or any trace of their DNA, but was not smart enough to hide their macabre plan. It was clear that their only goal was to murder the couple, and then it was time for the investigators to prove why. While Joan fought for her life in the hospital, the police authorities met with Christopher after he contacted them to inquire about what had happened to his parents. It turned out that the youngest son had received a call from a journalist who wanted information about the case, which is why Christopher called the police to know the truth. When they finally informed him that someone had broken into his parents' house, killed Peter, and injured Joan, Christopher showed no reaction. At no point did he seem overwhelmed by the severity of the situation. This caught the investigators' attention, but they had to remain calm and agreed to meet at the hospital where Joan was recovering. There, they had a 6-hour talk in which Christopher claimed that on the night of the crime, he had fallen asleep in a common area on campus. During his statement, a patrol went to the university where the 21-year-old studied, and the officers spoke with his peers, and what they told them did not help at all in proving his innocence. His peers described him as a friendly and humble guy, even though they knew Christopher belonged to a wealthy family that could afford great luxuries. He never acted superior to others. The police were alerted by these statements, as they knew the Porco family had a good socio-economic status, but they were far from being rich. They then understood that the young man had been lying to his friends all this time. On the other hand, the young students assured that they had seen Christopher on the afternoon of November 14th, in the common area where they gathered to watch television, and also in the morning of the 15th, but he had not been there during the night by any means. Everything began to indicate that Christopher was the only suspect. But then, 3 weeks after the incident, Joan woke up from the medically induced coma she had been in, and the investigation took an unexpected turn. The crime survivor was notified about the accusation she had made against her son, minutes before being admitted to the hospital. At that moment, Joan denied what the investigators were informing her. She said it was impossible that she had made such an accusation. She didn't remember anything from that day, and it was impossible that Christopher would attack them in that way. When she regained consciousness, Joan suffered from short-term memory loss, perhaps due to the trauma she had experienced, or maybe she just wanted to defend her son. The truth was that as soon as she denied Christopher being responsible for killing her husband, the investigation abruptly regressed. Thus, the progress they had made until then was paused for a moment. The authorities were forced to consider other possible lines of investigation that did not involve Christopher, so they decided to turn the search towards Peter's job. Since the man worked in the Court of Appeals, where family cases were usually presented as part of his job, some time ago, Peter had denied a man custody of his children. The violent reaction of that individual was accompanied by murder threats directed at Peter, which numerous witnesses were able to testify. The investigators pursued this theory and met with the possible suspect. However, it turned out to be a waste of time, as the man had a solid alibi. The agents returned to Theory 1. No one knew where Christopher had been on the night of November 15th. They then reviewed the timeline in which the house alarm had been deactivated, marked around 12:15 in the morning. At that same moment, the telephone lines had been cut. Then they knew they were back in operation around 5 in the morning. Furthermore, they accessed Peter's private information, specifically his email. What they found there were clues that brought them closer to their main suspect. Once again, everything led to Christopher. The week before the murder, Peter sent an email to Christopher, informing him that he had learned from his bank that he had taken out a $31,000 loan without his authorization. The man expressed his anger and disappointment in that message for having lied to him, and warned him that if it happened again, he would have to report him. Subsequently, he clarified to his son that Joan, his mother, was worried about his actions, wanted to see him, and that whatever happened, they could solve it. The investigators had found a compelling motive for Christopher to decide to end his parents' lives, but now it was time to find concrete evidence. They went once again to the university and requested access to the security cameras, and that's how they saw the footage capturing the yellow Jeep, which belonged to the suspect, leaving the campus on the night of the 14th, around 10:30 p.m. According to the agent's calculations, if Christopher had driven on the highway, he had enough time to reach his parents' house by 2 a.m. They needed to prove that he was driving the vehicle, so they approached the toll booths on the highway that connected the university to the house in Delmar. The employees assured they had seen a yellow Jeep that night. They remembered it because it was speeding. One of the witnesses said it was a young white male, but still, a piece of evidence was missing to effectively prove it. Then, the investigators embarked on a meticulous job. They knew that those who passed through the tolls received a ticket, which they then had to present at the next one to be charged the corresponding rate. These tickets were stored in boxes by the employees, who always operated with gloves. They requested the box containing all the tickets collected that day and sent them to be analyzed, one by one, in a laboratory in order to obtain Christopher's DNA from one of them. And so it happened. One of the tickets had been handled by the boy. Everything fit perfectly. They finally had what they needed to arrest him. It took the authorities a year of investigation, and in that way, they managed to arrest Christopher Porco for murdering his father and attempting to do the same with his mother. To regain his freedom, he had to pay a bail of $250,000, which paradoxically, Joan Porco and her friends took care of collecting so that Christopher could return to his regular life. The young man moved in with his mother while waiting to stand trial. During this period, Joan continued insisting to the authorities to leave her son alone and raised her discontent in a public letter, which was released in the media. In it, she asked the investigators to stop pursuing her son and to focus on finding the real criminal. But after several more months, the time for the trial came. Christopher arrived at the venue accompanied by his mother, whom he was arm in arm with, and the round of statements began. The prosecution presented all the evidence positioning Christopher as the sole responsible for the atrocious crime, while the defense attempted to exonerate him by questioning certain aspects. On one hand, they wondered how it was possible that if Christopher had been the murderer, he left the house without the slightest trace of blood. On the other hand, they claimed he could never have driven to his parents' house because no young person has that much cash on hand to stop for gasoline and pay at the toll booths. This was because the opposing side knew very well that the boy had removed the electronic device for toll collection, using cash to avoid being tracked. As absurd as these arguments sounded, the jury still had to meet to determine a verdict, taking into account all the information provided by the investigators. Christopher had a financial motive. No one knew where he had been on the morning of November 15th, until the cameras captured him driving his yellow Jeep, and he was one of the few who knew the code to the house alarm. Additionally, one of the witnesses at the trial was his former boss, the owner of a veterinary clinic where Christopher had worked and where he had learned how to avoid being splattered with blood in surgery. The jury had no doubts at the time of their verdict. On August 10, 2006, Christopher Porco, the younger son of Peter and Joan, was sentenced to a total of 50 years in prison for the murder of his father and attempted murder against his mother. The image of a united family that the Porcos had portrayed throughout their lives ended in the past, with the terrible tragedy they went through at the hands of their youngest son. Christopher's criminal behavior which they had kept silent and managed to hide for years, finally came to light on November 15, 2004. The whims of the boy to be someone he was not, to invent a life he didn't have, and a social status he didn't belong to, led him to commit a series of crimes against his own parents. The fatal outcome didn't just happen. To sustain the lies he had told throughout his time at university, he repeatedly stole belongings from his parents and friends, which he then sold on the internet, where he ironically scammed people. When it was time to deliver the products, he didn't, and later he impersonated his brother's identity and used his account to tell buyers that Christopher had passed away. On multiple occasions, he forged Peter's signature to obtain loans from the bank, and so financed the yellow Jeep truck. When he had no way out, he decided to murder them to keep the money and assets of his parents. Even days before the act, he approached a financial investor for advice, as he would soon receive a large sum of money that he wanted to invest. The case of Peter Porco clearly shows how far a person lacking feelings but full of greed can go. It also highlighted the impeccable work of the investigators, who, even with the victim against them, used all their tools and even more to finally do justice for Peter Porco. This case still causes controversy within the community, with some believing that Christopher's conviction was fair, while others believe he was not the author of the terrible murder. Hibon Federico Diaz was a 27-year-old man who lived in the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina, with his mother and his stepfather. He was characterized as a very calm young man, completely devoted to his loved ones, and he loved spending time with his godchildren, as his older siblings had given him the pleasure of being a godfather. Since his adolescence, Hibon knew that he needed to find a job to help support his family, and that's how he found a job at a nearby supermarket. Every day without fail, he would get up and go to work, never asking for a day off unless it was absolutely necessary. However, nobody appreciated his good performance. Hibon was very open about his attraction to people of the same gender. He never had a problem admitting that he liked men. This made him the subject of ridicule from his colleagues and even his supervisors. Hibon endured this for a long time, as he wanted to save up to buy a piece of land and build a house there, but the annoyance caused by the harassment from his colleagues led him to seriously consider looking for another job. And he almost did, until a kind of light appeared at the end of the tunnel. During the year 2016, within the same supermarket, he met Fernando Ambrosio, a 30-year-old man who instantly captivated him. They started their relationship as friends and over the weeks began to see each other more and more often since both lived in the same city. The relationship eventually became romantic, but it wasn't perfect. It had to be kept a secret, as Fernando was married to a woman and had 2 young children. He had no interest in the rest of the world, knowing his true orientation. Shortly after, Fernando's wife became pregnant. He told Hibon that the best thing was to end their relationship. This upset Hibon quite a bit, however. Passion was stronger, and a few months later, they started seeing each other again. Through 2 years of encounters as passionate as they were clandestine, in 2019, Fernando decided to end the relationship forever, feeling that they were being too obvious and not wanting to raise suspicions in his family. From then on, Hibon would never be the same. For many months, he wondered, why had he made such a sudden decision? The pain turned into anger, and one day, Hibon decided to threaten Fernando, telling him that if he didn't come back to him, he would tell everything about their romance to his wife. Fernando did not take this well. By that time, Hibon was transferred to another branch of the supermarket, and they never saw each other again. On September 19, Hibon, who was then 30 years old, left his house to enjoy his day off, and while he was heading to take public transport, he ran into his brother, who greeted him cheerfully, not knowing that there was something different in Hibon. For the first time in many months, he was happy. What he was completely unaware of was that this would be the last time he would see him. That night, the man did not return home. His mother tried to call him several times, but he never answered. After leaving 100 messages, they decided to search for him in the neighborhood. However, there were no traces of him. Nobody had seen him since the afternoon. They went to the police station to file a missing person report, but the police told them that to formalize it, they had to wait at least 48 hours. It wasn't necessary, as by the next day, there were already news about Hibon, but they were not good at all. It was 6 p.m. on Friday, September 20, 2019, when the police received an emergency call. Some people had found the completely naked body in a nearby field. The patrol command unit arrived at the scene, and upon seeing the body, they were completely astonished. The body had 6 stab wounds and had cuts on the arms, 1 leg, and the abdomen. However, that was not the most terrifying part, but the fact that the eyes and a section of the intestines had been removed. The condition was so terrible that the officers could not identify who it belonged to, although they could determine it was a man. The agents theorized that the motive for the murder could have been related to drug trafficking. This theory was based precisely on the extraction of the eyes from the eye sockets. They believed that the victim had seen something he shouldn't have, or maybe he was a mule carrying drugs in his stomach, and that was why his intestines had been cut. The body was transferred to the forensic office for the corresponding autopsy, where it was determined that it was none other than Hibon. The studies also showed that the body presented all types of injuries, including fractures and several cuts. Part of the scalp had also been removed. It was also established that the cuts had been made with a scalpel, and that the attack was sudden, so the victim couldn't even defend himself from his aggressor. Although the body presented a lot of savagery, not everything seemed to be the work of humans. Having been exposed for more than 14 hours, the local birds could have plucked the victim's eyeballs, and stray dogs might have devoured his intestines. The case was investigated as an aggravated homicide. Newspapers and television channels quickly picked up the news, awakening fear among the population. With such a terrible case under his jurisdiction, the prosecutor had no choice but to get to work to find the sinister murderer. After receiving the painful news, Hibon's relatives offered their testimony before justice, sharing everything they knew about his life, as anything could help understand the motive for the crime and thus lead to its author. In all the statements, there was a fact that stood out above the rest: the romantic relationship Hibon had had with a man. While they did not know his name or surname, they could describe him as a man with dark skin. They also knew that the relationship had not ended well. On one occasion, this man had gone to Hibon's house with his wife. Since Hibon was not there, he left a message with one of his brothers. The message was very clear. He wanted Hibon to stop bothering him. After this revelation, the case took a 180-degree turn. The theory of a drug trafficking problem was completely discarded, and the motive shifted to a possible love triangle. But the testimonies of Hibon's relatives alone were not enough. The agents decided to summon some of his colleagues from the first supermarket branch where he worked. A woman and a colleague of Hibon confirmed the romantic link between the two men and provided names and specific details. She recounted that everyone at supermarket knew Hibon had a relationship with a man who worked as an external restocker named Fernando Ambrosio. Initially, everything was going relatively well, But at some point, they began to fight all the time. The already bad situation escalated even more when they were found being intimate in the supermarket's storage area. The supervisor decided to transfer Hibon. The woman took advantage of her statement to emphasize that the young man had been harassed for a long time because of his sexual orientation, not only by his colleagues but also by the supervisor and Fernando himself. With the testimonies collected, the prosecutor no longer had doubts that this man was at least a suspect in the crime. He went along with other agents from the Buenos Aires police to raid his house, and there the doubts turned into certainties. On the street, the officers randomly chose a witness to attest to the procedure, which is extremely necessary in Argentina. Then they entered the home, where they found no element that could contribute to the investigation, nor were there any signs of bloodstains being cleaned. They were about to leave without having obtained any evidence when the witness asked to make a statement. He recounted that on September 20, he had run into Fernando in the street, as they were neighbors. As if it were an ordinary conversation, the man told him that he knew the young man who had appeared dead. He also said that the previous day he had met with him since he had picked him up at his house, and they went together to the river. There, they chatted for a while until they said goodbye near the stream. After that, he didn't hear from him again until he saw the news. The situation was quite extraordinary. The accused himself had placed himself at the location where the victim's body was found, on the same day he disappeared. The investigators theorized that Fernando probably did this out of fear that some security camera might have captured him, evidenced by the emphasis he had placed on explaining that he left the place while Hibon was still alive. However, this testimony was not enough evidence to arrest him. The agents conducted luminal tests in his car in search of bloodstains, but they were negative. By then, they were certain that the crime had been committed Fernando, while they continued looking for clues. Team from the local police began to covertly surveil Fernando, but the intelligence work did not take long, and very soon they found the missing piece of the puzzle. By intercepting his cell phone, they discovered that in the days before the crime, Fernando had communicated with a man named Jonathan, who was called Mosquito, a 42-year-old bricklayer, who was working on his house doing some repairs. Moreover, Fernando had asked him for help with something. On October 4, the officers went to Jonathan's home. When surrounded by agents, the man broke down and decided to tell the whole truth. He said that one day while he was working at Fernando's house, he was offered 3,000 Argentine pesos to help him scare a guy who was bothering him, and Jonathan, who lived off occasional jobs and needed money, accepted without hesitation. On September 19, he received the instructions. He had to hide in the trunk of Fernando's car. From there, they would pick up Hibon. The first part of the plan went perfectly. When they parked in the area of the river, Fernando got out of the vehicle with Hibon, and they began to argue heatedly. Jonathan heard screams and blows but could not see what was happening. After a few seconds, the noise ceased. Fernando told Jonathan to get out of the car and help him put Hibon's body in the trunk. By then, the young man was not breathing. It was not what they had agreed upon, but Jonathan preferred not to ask questions. After wrapping the body, they drove about 300 meters to an open field, took the body out of the car, and dragged it to leave it under a tree. After giving his testimony, Jonathan was detained that same day, and the agents headed to Fernando's home, arriving just in time, as according to intelligence work, the subject was planning to flee to the interior of the country. Following Jonathan's directions, they checked a shed of another house located in a nearby town. There, they found various valuable objects that were identified by Hibon's relatives, as well as blood-stained clothing. The objects were subjected to forensic tests, and they matched the DNA of the victim. With both accused detained, the agents thought the investigation was closed. but there was still something to be resolved: the motive for the crime. That's when a key testimony appeared, surprising everyone working on the case. Teresa, Fernando's wife, said she wanted to testify before justice. She recounted that at the end of 2016, Hibon had contacted her to tell her that he was her husband's lover. This seemed very strange to her, so she decided to have a straightforward conversation with Fernando. He flatly denied it, and she, with all the love she had for him, chose to believe him. They were calm for a while until Hibon reappeared. On that second occasion, he sent Teresa images of Fernando without clothes. There was no doubt what Hibon was saying was true. The woman decided to separate from her husband, but this only lasted a few days. Fernando swore that his thing with Hibon had been a momentary confusion and that it had not gone beyond some chats. He denied that they were a couple or that they had had relations. Again, Teresa chose to trust him, and they reconciled. To prevent Hibon from interfering in their marriage, they both decided to change their cell phones and forgot about the issue for a while, as if nothing had happened. However, more than a year later, Hibon reappeared in their lives. This time he contacted her via Facebook, sent her photographs and videos where Fernando was seen being intimate with another man. Teresa chose not to give importance to the messages from this man, decided that it was best if the matter remained within the family, and saw Hibon as an intruder. She blocked him, but the harassment continued. The man managed to create up to 4 fake accounts per day to send her messages, increasingly aggressive, telling her over and over that she was fat and that Fernando would eventually leave her because he did not love her. That's when they realized that the situation was beyond them and that they could no longer resolve it alone. On April 17, 2019, 5 months before the crime, Teresa went with her husband to file a complaint at the police against Hibon for stalking and alleged threats. However, it did not prosper. After hearing this story, the prosecution confirmed that the complaint was real. Fernando also handed over his cell phone so that they could see the messages he had with Hibon, where he threatened him, saying that if he left him, he would tell everything to his mother and the rest of his relatives. But this did not serve to free Fernando from trial. Everything indicated that Hibon had been murdered in retaliation for the extortion attempts. With both in pre-trial detention, Fernando accused Jonathan of delivering the blow to Hibon that took his life. However, the autopsy revealed that the crime was carried out by 2 people. Neither could escape the sentence. In the document prepared for the trial, Fernando was accused of planning and executing the murder of Hibon, fearing that Hibon would expose his sexual orientation. Jonathan, on the other hand, was accused of being an accomplice for having helped him hide the body. In the same file, the prosecutor carried out a detailed reconstruction of the events, from when Fernando and Hibon met in 2016 until the day of the murder. They had started their friendship at the supermarket, and over the months, they became a couple. When Fernando's wife became pregnant, he decided to end things with Hibon. Hibon did not take this well, threatening him by saying that if he left him, he would tell everything to his mother. They eventually resumed their relationship, but in 2019, Fernando told him it was all over. Hibon, completely infuriated, started sending intimate videos and photographs of him to his wife. They filed a complaint at the police station, but it did not prosper. Seeing that Hibon's blackmail continued, Fernando contacted Jonathan for help. On September 19, 2019, Fernando sent a message to Hibon saying he wanted to meet him, probably lying by saying he wanted to settle things and even resume their romantic relationship. Hibon agreed. In the afternoon, Fernando picked him up with his car from downtown and drove to a place where they got out to chat and have some tea. With the excuse of going to get something from the trunk, Fernando left it open. At some point, one of the attackers hit Hibon on the head with an iron bar, fracturing his skull. They then proceeded to strip him, cut his neck and abdomen with a scalpel, put him inside a bag, and covered him with a sheet to avoid leaving bloodstains in the vehicle. They then drove to the open field of a nearby river, where they finally placed the body. The prosecutor stated that Fernando took advantage of the trust and love Hibon had for him to deceive him into going out. There, along with Jonathan, they took advantage of his defenseless state to murder him and make him suffer, proceeding to beat and stab him savagely on multiple occasions. Both Fernando and Jonathan were accused of aggravated homicide due to the use of a knife, premeditation, cruelty, treachery, and for promise of payment. The additional aggravating factor of being in a romantic relationship was added to Fernando, and the most probable sentence was life imprisonment. The oral trial began on April 8, 2022, and to this day, the case remains open. Forensic studies have not been able to determine whether Hibon died from the severe head injuries or from the 6 stab wounds he received. It has also not been defined which of the 2 accused delivered the fatal attack. Fernando continued to say that he opened the trunk so Jonathan could come out and hit Hibon. Jonathan, for his part, continues to state that Fernando told him to get out of the car once Hibon had already been murdered. The victim's family, distrusting the justice system, fears that the accused may be released. They disagree with certain evidence from the investigation, asserting that Hibon was a calm and introverted person who would never have blackmailed anyone. They emphasized on several occasions that he was harassed both by Fernando and his coworkers due to his orientation. While the messages showed that Hibon threatened Fernando on several occasions, nothing justifies committing a crime. These cases rarely go to trial, and those that do are often archived or dismissed without a sentence for the perpetrators. Hibon's family hopes that the same will not happen and that his death will not go unpunished. Laura Lopez was born on November 11, 2000, in the city of Plovier, Argentina. Her older sisters, Melissa and Damaris, adored her from the very first moment. When Laura was just 3 years old, her mother passed away in a car accident, leaving the 3 sisters in the care of their father. Initially, he worked hard to keep the family afloat, but a few years later, he fell into alcoholism. Despite the terrible things happening around her, Laura was a very sweet and affectionate child, which is why her sisters started calling her Cielo, or Heaven, in English, a nickname that everyone who knew her would eventually adopt. As the years went by, the girl's father lost his job, and all of them had to look for work. At 18, Laura spent her days selling fried cakes, then attended high school in the evening shift, and in her free time, she took care of her nephews. She was very close to graduating and dreamed of finding a good job to restore financial stability to her family. Unfortunately, an event occurred that prevented this from happening. On September 12, 2019, Cielo spent the entire afternoon with Damaris, serving her mate while she cleaned the house. Her sister joked that it was the first time she had made the infusion correctly. It was a cheerful day. Later, Cielo went to school, where her classmates noticed she was acting strange. She didn't sit in her usual spot, but at the back of the classroom and left 20 minutes before class ended. Around 11:30 p.m., she arrived home, where she met up with some friends. They spent a good time chatting, drinking beer, and taking selfies to post on Instagram. At 3 in the morning, they said goodbye to Cielo because she was very tired and said she was going to sleep. The next day, Nelisa wrote to her asking if she had gone to a medical appointment for an ear problem, but she got no response. She then called Damaris to find out if she was with her. The concern grew as Cielo was also not at her house. Hours passed, and the young woman still hadn't appeared, so they decided to report her missing to the police. Once at the police station, the officers told them they had to wait 48 hours from the last time they saw Cielo to request a search. They claimed she was probably with some boy, as this was supposedly common among teenagers. However, by Saturday, Cielo had not shown any signs of life, and the police finally took the report and began searching for her, but it was already too late. On Sunday the 15th, two fishermen, aged between 20 and 30, were carrying out their work in the area of the breakwaters of the Limahi River. This location was only 15 kilometers from Cielo's house. They were calm until they saw something that took their breath away. The body of a young woman, cut into 8 parts, floating in the water. They quickly notified the authorities. On arrival, the first thing the authorities noticed was the brutality of the body's condition. It had clearly been cut by someone skilled with knives. The detectives continued to search the area to see if they could find clues about the victim's identity. Nearby in the same river, they found some tights and underwear. Not far away, they found 2 rings and, eventually, a knife full of blood at the bottom of the river. They decided to call Cielo's family. When Damaris arrived at the scene and saw the objects, she did not doubt for a second that they belonged to her sister. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Carlos, who noted that the cause of death had been a severe skull trauma, causing internal cerebral hemorrhage. The trauma was caused by a blow to the occipital part of the head, resulting in loss of consciousness. Cielo had been agonizing for 2 to 4 hours. Had she received medical attention, she might have survived. She also had bruises on her arms, indicating she had been struck and had struggled to save herself from her attacker. Moreover, the forensic examination confirmed what Cielo's sisters feared. The body had intimate injuries compatible with abuse. Finally, it indicated that due to the characteristics of the cuts on the neck, arms, and legs, it could be affirmed that the perpetrator used knives with a flat and scalloped edge, meaning they had no medical or anatomical knowledge, which broadened the list of suspects. The detectives had no idea who could have committed such a heinous crime. By analyzing the location of Cielo's cell phone, they detected that a man had contacted her after 3 in the morning on Friday. His name was Alfredo Escobar. He was 28 years old and worked as a mechanic. In the past, he had attended the same high school as Cielo. He was fond of fishing, which likely meant he knew how to handle a knife. The distance between his home and the crime scene was 2.5 kilometers, or about 20 blocks, which helped with the cell phone tower signals. At 3 o'clock, 3:22, 3:36, and 3:40 a.m. on September 13th, the young woman received 4 calls from this man. By then, the cell towers placed each of them in their respective homes. Then both cell phones were activated at her house. Starting at 4:29 a.m., the young woman's phone moved towards the downtown area and ended up at Escobar's residence. At 5 a.m., Cielo uploaded a WhatsApp story with an alien emoji. Her cell phone was still at the man's house. By 5:52 a.m., the young woman's mobile phone stopped emitting a signal, and after that, no one heard from her again. These records also showed that Escobar turned off his cell phone until 11:05 p.m. the next day. At that time, the phone was picked up by a cell tower in the place where Cielo's remains were later found. At 12:05 a.m. on Sunday, September 15th, he returned to his home. The investigation also included analysis of videos from 13 security cameras, including urban monitoring, private homes, and businesses, specifically reviewing footage from the early hours of September 13th. In 2 of these video records, 2 people could be seen walking back to back, resembling Cielo and Escobar, matching the young woman's cell phone movement. There was no doubt Escobar was the only suspect in the case. During the investigation, one of the officers recognized him, recalling an encounter a year prior. Escobar had crashed into a police patrol while driving at over 80 kilometers per hour, resisted arrest, and had an active case against him. He was close to going to trial for this incident, but now he faced a completely different and much more serious charge. On September 17th, a police watch was set up about 30 meters from Escobar's house. At 8:30 a.m., they saw a car arrive, and a young person who appeared to be the suspect got out. He entered the house and then came out accompanied by two adults around 60 years old. All three got into the vehicle. Without raising suspicion, the officers followed the vehicle for a while, noting that it stopped near a highway bridge. At that moment, Escobar and the older man got out of the car, and the police approached them to request their documentation. Escobar was in the company of his father, and the other person inside the vehicle was none other than his mother. It was clear they were attempting to flee the city. The young man did not resist the procedure but appeared extremely nervous. He asked if he could smoke and wanted to move away from the police car. When told this was not possible, he put out the cigarette sack in his car and lit one. After a while, he was taken to the police station, and the vehicle was confiscated. A few hours later, he underwent medical examinations, which revealed inflammation in the knuckles of his right hand, consistent with having thrown a punch. He also had cuts on one finger and a bruise on the palm of his right hand. These injuries dated back a few days, likely to the date of Cielo's death, probably incurred while attacking the young woman. Following these examinations, Escobar was formally charged with abuse, carnal access, and femicide, utilizing his right to remain silent. He was placed in pretrial detention for 6 months, as there was considered to be a risk of flight or obstruction of the investigation. On September 17th, the first search of the Escobar family's house was conducted. The property was large, with 60 meters in depth and 12 meters in front. In the back, there was a construction project of 2 apartments. Entering the room where Escobar slept, they discovered that the walls had marks. They tested them with luminol and found what they suspected: blood. Then they went to the backyard, where things only got worse. Among the vegetation, they found blood remains. It was clear that Cielo had received there the blow that caused her death. The investigators took the blood to compare it with Cielo's and Escobar's, and also ordered a DNA test on the fluid found on Cielo's body to see if it matched the suspects. Escobar's lawyer argued that until those results were available, they should not accuse him of abuse. Fortunately, the results arrived quickly. The Central Laboratory of the Ministry of Public Health compared the samples collected during the search with the genetic profile of the victim and the accused. All showed a match. They also analyzed the sneakers that Escobar was wearing at the time of his arrest and the knife found at the bottom of the river. Both items had Cielo's DNA on them. Then, 3 swabs were taken from the intimate areas, and one of them showed compatibility with Escobar's DNA. The investigators were now in a position to affirm that the subject had abused Cielo, then murdered her, dismembered her, and disposed of her body. On September 21, the justice system confirmed these findings during a press conference. The case prosecutor stated that he suspected the individual had murdered Cielo to hide the abuse. If found guilty of this charge, he would receive a life sentence. However, more evidence was still needed. Escobar declared himself innocent, but again, technology would expose him. His cell phone was confiscated, and by court order, he had to provide the access code for forensic analysis. It was found that although he had Cielo among his contacts, he had deleted her after the night of her disappearance. After committing the act, Between 6 and 10 in the morning, he deleted the call log to the victim, but he did not delete their Facebook Messenger chat. The investigation also revealed that on September 11, 12, and 13, the subject had accessed the social network to view the photographs Cielo uploaded. Despite the evidence, the sinister man continued to claim his innocence, but everything was against him. A hypothesis was finally formulated about what happened on the night of the crime. On Thursday, September 12, 2019, Cielo left high school around 8 at night, returned home, and spent some time with friends until 3 in the morning, when she told them she was tired and would go to sleep. 40 minutes after she was left alone, she received a message from Escobar, and they began to chat. Although they knew each other from living in the same city and attending the same school, they were not friends. However, they had mutual acquaintances, which gave her confidence. After a while of chatting, the subject asked if she could come over. She calmly accepted, and at 4, he picked her up and went to his house. What happened in the house was a mystery, but considering the forensic analysis, it was believed that Cielo opposed having relations with the man. Completely enraged, he proceeded to abuse her. After committing the terrible act, he began to fear that she would report him. That's when he decided to take her life. He took her to the back of the house and hit her twice in the head. However, he did not achieve his goal. Cielo was still alive, agonizing. In a totally cruel act, Escobar hid her body for a couple of hours while thinking about what to do. He turned off his phone so that no one would bother him. Cielo's body was in the under construction part of the house for almost 24 hours. During that time, the contusion she had received took her life. Finally, the subject dismembered the body with a sharp knife from his kitchen, hid the body in his car, and drove 15 kilometers to the area at the Limahe River. He disposed of the body parts, throwing them away as if they were worthless. Once there, he turned his phone back on, relieved and believing he had finished the job. The story of the case became public, and all of city strongly condemned the accused. But the most striking declaration came from Escobar's 23-year-old younger sister, who posted a message on her social networks addressing both her brother and the victim. The publication received mixed reactions. Some people empathized with her, while others accused her of being complicit. Following these attacks, the girl asked that the focus not be lost on what was important, Cielo and her family. She demanded that the fight continue so that there would be no more victims of femicide. Melissa, on her part, contacted Escobar's sister and thanked her for the post. She also requested that people stop attacking her, as she was not to blame. Then the trial against the accused began. In the first hearing, the prosecutor accused Escobar of being the only responsible for the act. The charge was for aggravated homicide against a woman, involving gender violence and abuse with carnal access. In that same hearing, the experts who had intervened in the analysis of the clothing found in the river alongside the remains, and in the evidence found at the bottom of the subject's home, testified. But the most striking confession came from Cielo's best friend. During the trial, she recounted that for months, Escobar had been sending messages to Cielo, inviting her to have a good time and drink beer, but they had never had a date. For her part, she had known him for about 5 years and was aware of his bad reputation. For a long time, Escobar's house had been a party place. Every weekend, the house was filled with alcohol and substances, and there were even couples who had intimacy in front of the rest of those present. She had attended those gatherings but decided to distance herself from that environment when she started a relationship and became pregnant. She emphasized that Cielo had never gone with her. She repeatedly advised Cielo not to meet with Escobar. Cielo always said she wouldn't and that she ignored his messages. However, the defense asked why she didn't recommend Cielo to block the contact. Firmly, she replied that it was her friend's decision, and she didn't want to tell her what to do with her life. While she remained on the stand, she was shown the security camera footage from the day Cielo disappeared. They specifically showed her the footage from 4 in the morning, where 2 people were seen walking backwards through downtown. She had no doubt in recognizing that it was Cielo. She said that her sneakers, her coat, and her way of walking were unmistakable, and she also identified Escobar. As if this witness was not enough, another woman expressed her need to testify against the accused. The prosecution and the victim's family requested that her name remain anonymous and that the accused not be present. The judge granted the request, but allowed the accused to stay on one side of the room, out of the witness's sight. The woman narrated that, sometime before the incident, Escobar had gone out with her. They met through Facebook, the same social network through which he contacted Cielo. They bought 2 beers and took a walk around the neighborhood, then bought 2 more beers. It was then that Escobar invited her to his house with clear intentions of intimacy. She told him she didn't want to, and the man appeared frustrated, but did not force her. She told him she wanted to change, to be someone new. They were together until about 2 in the morning. Once Escobar returned home, he messaged her again, asking her to have sex. He insisted for a while, but she stopped responding. It was probably at that moment that he contacted Cielo. When the girl found out he was the main suspect in the incident, she was in shock. She hesitated a lot before going to the police station, thinking that if she talked to him, she might convince him to turn himself in voluntarily, but that didn't happen. After hearing the statement, the defense asked if Escobar had been violent towards her in an attempt to discredit her story. She replied that he had not. However, Escobar's impulsive behavior was evident when a friend testified against him, saying he was a womanizer with a substance addiction. His ex-partner also took the stand, stating they had not ended on good terms. Years earlier, she had reported him because she suspected that he had broken into her house and stolen her money. When she confronted him to return her things, Escobar hit the friend who was with her. In response to these statements, the accused tried to defend himself, pointing to a friend who was also his drug dealer as the perpetrator of the crime. He narrated that on the night in question, he was under the influence of substances, and this man was with Cielo at his house. At one point, Escobar heard a scream from one of his rooms and ran to see what had happened. Once he saw the blood, he focused on cleaning it up, then helped his friend hide Cielo's body, referring to it as that thing. At the end of his story, he thanked for having the space to share his version of the truth. However, no evidence was found, and this statement did not prosper. Escobar remained the only suspect. In his closing argument, the prosecutor argued that the man had taken advantage of his prior knowledge of the victim and betrayed her trust. He planned the brutality of his actions and the despicable manner in which he had dismembered and hidden the body. He asserted that the accused had a contemptuous relationship with women, evidenced when he referred to Cielo's body as that thing. The jury's deliberation took only 40 minutes. In a unanimous verdict, Escobar was found guilty of abuse with carnal access and homicide. The latter had the aggravating factor of having been carried out to hide the abuse and for involving gender violence. For this reason, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Although the case did not go unpunished and tranquility was restored to the community, the problem has not been solved. The rate of cases in Argentina continues to rise every minute. The case of Cielo highlights the need for a program to educate children, young people, and adults on gender issues. The young woman's family launched an initiative to make this possible. In September 2020, almost a year after the murder, the Cielo Lopez law was approved. This law mandates training on the subject for students and teachers at all levels of the provincial educational system to prevent violence against women.